Good evening and welcome to BBC Television's coverage of this Razor's Edge, Election 74. Tonight and for the next 24 hours, we shall be forecasting the outcome, reporting the results as they happen, talking to the new Prime Minister, and analysing how your vote has affected the government of this country. Sharing in the excitement with us until the early hours of the morning, the traditional throng of people from around the world in Trafalgar Square, who tend to come out even on a chilly election night. And also sharing the programme with us, viewers in Europe, Japan and America, who are themselves caught up in what may be the most important political decision in Britain since the war. So who is going to win? Who will be living at number 10 Downing Street for the next 5 years? Or the next 5 weeks? Who will be representing your constituency? And how will the Liberals get on?
Well, it's quite pointless, really, winning a seat in the House, because it's very difficult to find one that Cyril Smith isn't sitting in.
Mike Yarwood, who will be watching the election with us here in the studio tonight. Well, today we've been trying to get an early answer to some serious questions in 3 carefully selected constituencies where our pollsters have been asking, how did you vote? And the 3 constituencies are Bristol North West, Halifax and Watford. And while we are waiting for the latest returns to come in from that count, Robert Mackenzie, how will these polls relate to your swingometer?
Well, the swingometer has been a great friend through 5 elections, but obviously it's in bigger trouble tonight because it really talks about the swing between the big parties, the 2 major parties, and we may now have a 3rd major party before the night's over. But if there's a swing of 1% to the Tories tonight, then they've got a majority of roughly 90 over Labour, and if there's roughly 30 Liberals and others, as the polls suggest, then they've got a comfortable majority. If, on the other hand, the swing goes the other way, from the position at the last election to 1%, toward Labour, the Tories will still have a 25-seat lead over Labour, but may not have an overall majority. Then we get into the area of uncertainty, a swing of 2% to Labour, and the Liberals certainly probably hold the balance of power. It's not until we get 2.5% to Labour that you've got a clear majority for Labour in that situation. So this is the situation we're waiting for now, the first indication of which way the swingometer swings.
Well, I think we may have the first indications. These figures come just about half an hour before the polls closed, and these are our straw polls in these constituencies. First, Watford. Conservatives, 33.5%. Labour, 39.7%. Liberal, 25.4%. National Front, 1.4%. Well, now, let's have a look now at Bristol North West. Conservative, 42.4%. Labour, 35.4%, Liberal, 21.8%, Independent, 0.4%. Well now, David Butler, what about those 2 results, Watford and Bristol, which seem to point in different directions?
They do indeed. There's a 3% swing to Labour on those figures from Watford. It was won by 76 votes by Labour in the last election. It couldn't have been closer. Now it is a 3% swing. It's comfortably Labour on these figures. Of course, they aren't quite the close of the poll, but one might expect the later figures to be slightly better for Labour. But the big other thing there is 25.4% for the Liberals. That is a very high vote. Last time they got 8.8% of the vote. That's 16.5% increase for the Liberals. It certainly suggests that the opinion polls this morning were not wrong in indicating a really remarkably high Liberal vote by any standard we've known since the war.
But these are, of course, not actual results. One should say this. These are polls taken today as people were themselves actually voting. And I think we have the 3rd constituency result. No, we haven't got the Halifax result yet. That may decide which way it comes round. Now, the Bristol result, David?
Well, the Bristol result is the kind of mirror image of what we had in Watford. That's to say, there is a 2.5% swing to the Conservatives in this seat, which is virtually unchanged from last time. The Liberals get 21.8%, slightly less than in Watford, but still a very high vote. There aren't more than about 100 seats in the country where the Liberals have got over 20% in any election since the war. Now they got 21%, 25% in 2 seats, which until recently one wouldn't have thought of as Liberal territory.
All right, well, now let's have a look at the third seat, which we have again. The results taken half an hour before the polls closed on our opinion poll. Here are the Conservatives, 36%, Labour, 39.5%, and Liberal, 24.5%.
Well, a much narrower swing to Labour. It was won by Dr. Summerskill last election by 198 votes. It was as close as it could be, like Watford. Now there's a comfortable majority for her on these figures, these poll figures, 3.5% for her. That represents a 1.6% swing to Labour. That may actually exaggerate the move to Labour because there was an ILP, a left-wing candidate who got a small vote last time. So that means the real swing there may be just under 1%. Now, if you average these three polls together, you get a swing of about 0.5%. About 0.5% to Labour, which would probably take away the Conservatives' clear majority if the Liberals make the headway they are, over 20% in all these three seats.
So it is indeed as close as that on these three polls taken today. But Robert Mackenzie, how do these results from these polls tonight fit in with the pattern of the national opinion polls which appeared earlier today?
Well, as a matter of fact, they do point slightly in the other direction, because here were the final polls taken by the four major organizations that were reporting today. Gallup gave a 2% lead to the Conservatives, Harris a 3% lead, ORC a 4% lead, NOP a 5% lead. We've averaged those, and they point to something like a 60-seat Conservative majority over Labour. And when you allow for the likely projected 20 to 30 seats for Liberals, that would have given the Conservatives a majority rather like the one they had after the last election, something like 30 or 35 in the House of Commons. Looking back for a moment, however, to the swingometer, we're in a position, if David's initial analysis is right and those advanced polls are right, we're in a position rather like this, with a swing to Labour, which still leaves the Conservatives with more seats than Labour, but not necessarily enough to encompass the likely 30 Liberals and others. It really does point, in our straw polls, to the most exciting race we've seen since 1964.
And so that is what the next hours are going to be about. Will these predictions hold up, or will something happen to break them? We are joined now by Lou Harris. Lou Harris, these are your polls, and this is what they're saying tonight. But a number of us remember what the polls were saying in 1970. Now, what is the situation?
Let me say, these polls are being taken outside of the voting places as people come out of the voting, from voting, and I might say that whether or not they indeed are entirely accurate of what happens when the vote is counted remains to be seen. I would, however, like to make one point that we are seeing here, just from these three districts, if it holds up across the country, a rather massive rejection of the political establishment. You've got between, as I counted it up, between 5 and 12 points off for both the Conservatives and Labour in each of these districts. This means that people are saying, in effect, as they did indeed in our pre-election polls, there's something deeply wrong with the way politics have been run in the country.
Well, now, in the past, polls of this kind, taken as people, as you say, came out of the voting booths, have proved uncannily accurate, but now and again they have slipped.
Yes.
What are the dangers?
The dangers are that the partisans or voters of one party might not or might refuse to tell you where others might be perfectly fair game to do it. Also, you might get a late vote here. This is about 8:30, I believe, in the counts we have. We'll see what happens in the remaining hour and a half. That can make quite a difference in the vote.
Well, thank you, and we will, of course, have the full results just as soon as we can, just as soon as these counts are really completed in the counting stations. Well, if that's what the polls are saying at this stage of the night, what are the punters saying? Julian Wilson has had no racing on the course today because it's been election day, but tonight he's watching to keep us up to date on a race with no nags, but with plenty of money on the winner and on the losers. So we join Julian Wilson at Ladbrokes for the news from there.
Well, this is one race that I won't be needing these for. Not even to pick out the Liberals, traditionally at the back of the field, at least if recent events are anything to go by, because they've been the springers of this pre-election betting. This is the state of the betting this morning. Conservatives have always been favoured. They opened at 11 to 8 on at the start of the election campaign. They were offered at 5 to 2 on this morning. Labour, well, they opened at evens. They've always been on the drift. They were out to 9 to 4 this morning. There hasn't been the usual hedging bet from the city that one normally has for the socialists. For instance, bets like the £50,000 staked on them back in the 1964 election. The Liberals, well, they opened at 100 to 1, they went out to 200 to 1, and then they shortened right down to 25 to 1 and 33 to 1. Well, that was the start of the state of play this morning. But now, looking back over this vast betting hall at Ladbrokes, where 40 girls will be taking bets up till 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, and where already £920,000 has been staked on this election. The very latest odds are as follows. The Conservatives are now 7 to 2 on, very, very warm favourites indeed. Labour are 5 to 2 against, and Liberals are 100 to 1. Whereas over the other side of London, South London, William Hill's report that they've taken £750,000 on this election, more money than they've taken in the last 5 Grand Nationals, and their odds likewise are 7 to 2 on the Tories, 3 to 1 against Labour, and 33 to 1 against the Liberals. So, if money talks in general elections, Mr. Heath at present is looking very much like Nijinsky.
Well, Julian Wilson, I think if these polls taken through the day outside the polling booths are anything to go by, Nijinsky has got it all to do coming with a few furlongs to go, because in Bristol North West, the latest figures, the Conservative swing there not as great as it was. Lead for the Conservatives is 40.3%, Labour 37.1%, and Liberals as they were at about 21.8%. So
the swing to the Conservatives is 0.6, not 2.5 as it was on the earlier figures.
Well, these are not, of course, results. These are polls taken today, which have been, as I was saying, uncannily accurate sometimes, sometimes not quite so accurate. But certainly all the party leaders, I imagine, will be drawing breath and crossing and recrossing their figures after hearing some of these early ideas and early figures. Mr. Heath himself hasn't surfaced so far this evening, but we can get some idea of his mood today from David Dimbleby, who's been with Mr. Heath and his party at the Prime Minister's seat at Sidcup in Kent.
And is now sitting in the Assembly Hall of the Chislehurst and Sidcup Grammar School, where Mr. Heath will be coming for the declaration of the result round about 1 o'clock. The counters down there already assembling to check the ballots, the first start to the process of counting for this new constituency of Sidcup, which is a combination of the old Bexley and Chislehurst, a commuter belt to the southeast of London. And Mr. Heath arrived here this morning after casting his own vote at 9:15 in Westminster. He got here at 11 o'clock. He spent the whole day driving around in his motor car with his agent and his assistants here, going to every polling station, shaking hands with all 3 tellers of all 3 parties outside, all 4 parties actually here. He's been to the committee rooms twice. He's made in all 75 different visits, and he's now at his agent's house, having a bite of supper and putting his feet up and waiting to come down here for his own count. If it's any indication at all, there was a mock election at the school here today, and they've declared their result this afternoon. The Tories trounced everybody, including an extraordinary minority party, which isn't figuring in the national election, known as the Birthday Party. Anyway, round about 1 o'clock, we should have Mr. Heath's result. This is David Dimbleby in Sidcup.
And there's where Mr. Heath has to come and face the music in a short while, as David was saying. Mr. Wilson, too, is in his own constituency, Huyton, up there near Liverpool, and with the Wilson party, Michael Charlton.
And it's been a cold, bleak day up here in Huyton. Mr. Wilson's been out in the rain and the cold up to the last minute. I saw him about half an hour ago, still touring the electorate, still going into Labour committee rooms, speaking to people on their way to the polling stations just before they closed. It's going to be a cheerless prospect for Mr. Wilson here tonight if all those public opinion polls are correct. And yet no one more than he has reason to know that they can be completely wrong. As for his opponents, so too for Mr. Wilson. This is a decisive election. The rewards of victory for him are great, and the price of defeat will be heavy. They say in boxing, don't they, that they never come back. If Mr. Wilson does get back to Downing Street tonight, it'll be the first time that's happened since Churchill did it after the war. On the tables here at Huyton in his constituency, the ballot boxes, you may have seen some of them just arriving, the voting papers are starting to fall like leaves on the table. And when they're all swept up together later on tonight, they'll be telling us whether this is a new spring or the autumn of Mr. Wilson's long political career. Because on the result that they're going to tell us later this evening must depend, one must assume, his survival as leader of Labour and the future course and direction of a great British political party. Michael Charlton in Huyton.
And in Devon, the man whose personal popularity has been growing in the polls during the past three-week campaign, Jeremy Thorpe, and with the Thorpe party, David Lomax.
Well, Jeremy Thorpe's day started in the snow and is finishing in freezing rain, but that doesn't seem to have affected his energy or deterred his enthusiasm. He got up first thing from his thatched cottage at Higher Chuggerton, went down the road and cast his vote in the local chapel hall, and then, dressed in a funny sort of Russian hat, set off on a whirlwind trip round as many polling stations as he could possibly fit into the day. And there are about 90 of them in this vast constituency of North Devon, stretching all the way from Exmoor out towards Hartland. His rally driver, his friend, who's been his chauffeur throughout the campaign, said at the end of the day he'd have travelled 400 miles, more than 400 miles. So we might see him here in one piece when he comes into the count here at the Queen's Hall, Barnstaple, where, as you can see, the ballot boxes are all being turned over. People are counting the votes now, and we're expecting the result between 1:30 and 2 o'clock. You remember that Mr. Thorpe is defending his majority here of only 369 votes. This is David Lomax in Devon North.
And so at 10 to 10, all systems go, and all three party leaders reported, as you would expect, still in good shape and still apparently quietly confident, although the straw polls must give more comfort and hope to Mr. Wilson and to Mr. Thorpe than they do so far to Mr. Heath. But it's worth perhaps reminding ourselves at this moment why we are having a general election. Tom Mangold is in Yorkshire with a group of men who have very definite views about that.
Good evening from the Dennerby and Cadeby Miners' Welfare Club, deep in the heart of the South Yorkshire coalfields. The Dennerby has some of the most militant, and I don't think they'd object if I call them some of the most bloody-minded miners in the whole of Britain. These are some of the men whose point-blank refusal of the Coal Board's wages offer led to the overtime ban, the strike, and finally, depending on who you believe, the general election. Well, what have they achieved? Has it been worth it? And are these men here tonight still on a collision course with whoever rules Britain tomorrow? Gentlemen, Mr. Heath called a Who Governs Britain election. It was aimed at controlling militants like yourselves. This morning's opinion polls suggest a Conservative win. Has your action helped defeat a possible socialist government for the next 5 years? In other words, have you made a great political blunder? Eddie?
We never went into this wage demand to make any political blunder. It was never political from the start. I was accredited delegate to the conference in Inverness when the wage demand was submitted. And at nowhere in the discussions in Inverness was there any talk of taking on anyone.
Right, well, assuming that we have a Tory win tonight, nevertheless, has there not been a political blunder? Is it not possible that a socialist government will be out for the next 5 years, Arnie?
I don't think so. No matter what is said. If the miners hadn't come out on strike, it wouldn't have made any difference, because this Ted Heath used this, of course, to his own end.
Well, do you accept that this has been a political strike?
No, I don't.
No.
There's no politics involved in this at all from the start.
If I could come in here, Mr. Interviewer, you're wrong. It's never been a political strike. It never will be a political strike, because you've got to bear in mind this, that irrespective of what our NEC individually says, choose what they say, it is not a political strike, because I believe, when I say this, that I'm talking for the vast majority of the coal miners in this industry.
Yes, but
we have never tried to smash the government, we have never tried to smash Phase 3, and we have never tried to bring the country to its knees.
Well, I don't think you can say that you didn't try to...
Finish,
well, of course you tried to smash Phase 3, I can't accept that.
The public has a right to know. All we are fighting for is a decent living wage and better conditions for our members. Full stop.
Frank, you challenged the government on Phase 3, on their counter-inflation proposals. You indirectly challenged the authority of the government. Do you accept that you may have made a gross political blunder in doing that?
Not at all, not at all. Because I believe that we're entitled to make a profit on our labour. I don't envy the man with 2 Rolls Royces and 2 £20,000 houses. What I want our members to have is the right to buy one of each.
Jim, do you, a former miner, now a university lecturer, do you think that the National Union of Mine Workers did make a political blunder on this?
No, I think they had no options. Their members had a very low standard of living. They had to fight for what they considered right. I think what did happen was that the Conservative government attempted to take advantage of the attempts by ordinary men to improve their standard of life.
Gentlemen, I put it to you that if the Conservatives do win tonight, you're in danger of becoming totally isolated, not only by public opinion, but by your own trades union colleagues. Would you accept that?
I don't accept that at all. Not at all. Being isolated? No. Isolated? We're a member of the Trade Union Council, the Trade Union Congress. We are naturally a member, an affiliated member. How can we be alone?
Well, 5 million of your colleagues accepted phase 3.
Under protest. Under protest.
We've heard quite a lot about this 5 million. Teddy's the boy that's dished it out. 5 million people, the figure that I got was 6 million, have accepted under phase 3. They've accepted under duress. Who's accepted under phase 3? The ambulance drivers, the nurses.
Let me come in there.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to wind it here for the time being. Thank you very much indeed. This is Tom Mangold from Dennerby.
And in city halls and town halls and local government offices around Britain, many thousands of fingers are getting ready to leaf through the ballot papers and to count the crosses alongside the names of 2,197 candidates who stood for Parliament at this election. Unfortunately, only 635 of them can succeed. The rest, 1,400 or so, must fail. But could two of these candidates just possibly be Robert Carr, the Home Secretary, or Tony Benn, who was Labour's spokesman on trade and industry in the last Parliament, two of the more distinguished heads that could row? Richard Kershaw is with Mr. Carr in his marginal constituency at Carshalton, and Julian Pettifer with Mr. Benn in his marginal at Bristol South East. First, Mr. Carr.
This is a real cliffhanger for the Home Secretary in the new seat. For all his 24 years in Parliament, Mr. Robert Carr sat for the seat next door, for Mitcham, but with redistribution he was moved here to Carshalton. 26,000 of his former voters in Mitcham are now here, but 31,000, largely Conservative voters, have been moved out of the constituency. Perhaps more important, this is in the South London suburban belt, right next door to Sutton and Cheam, where the Liberals had their greatest by-election success 15 months ago with Graham Tope. Perhaps the result tonight may well depend on how much support and from whom the Liberals draw here. Well, there's been a big poll. All the parties are, as usual, talking confidently. This is Richard Kershaw in Carshalton, over to Bristol South East.
Here in Bristol South East, Mr. Anthony Wedgwood Benn, or Mr. Tony Benn, as he now calls himself, is fighting for his political future. He's held this seat for Labour for the past 24 years with a pretty handsome majority, but this time he really may be in trouble, largely because of changes in the constituency boundaries. Mr. Benn is further threatened by a proliferation of candidates. He faces not only the Tory, Mr. Norman Rees, who last time cut his majority by half, but also a Liberal, a Social Democrat, and a candidate of the National Front. Now, it seems that there's been a pretty large turnout here today, and there is perhaps one trend beginning to appear. It seems that in areas that traditionally have voted Tory, there has been a rather bigger turnout than in areas that traditionally have voted Labour. Now, if this persisted until the time that the polls closed, then it could mean trouble for Mr. Benn. This is Julian Pettifer in Bristol South East.
Two results there that we'll be particularly watching as the night progresses. But British elections are usually won on what is known as the middle ground of politics, which has been so determinedly fought over during this election. The Liberals, we certainly expect to do very well at the expense of the two major parties, but in Scotland and in Wales it is the Nationalists whose progress needs to be given most scrutiny. In the Scottish election studio, Magnus Magnusson.
Well, the opinion polls in Scotland suggest that the main beneficiaries of this third-party vote will in fact be the Scottish Nationalists and not the Liberals, although it's interesting that the combined total of the Liberals and the Nationalists is much higher than the UK total as a whole for this third-party vote. Up here it's 29%, and that's only 3 points lower than the Tories in Scotland. The Tories, although they've been sounding very confident, haven't been doing well in Scotland according to the opinion polls, which show that Labour has a comfortable lead of 6 points. And that should be enough to let them keep most of the considerable advantage that they had at the dissolution, 43 of Scotland's 71 seats compared with 23 Tory, 3 Liberal and 2 Nationalists. But it is the Nationalists who've been making much of the running here. They've shown a consistent rise right through to the latest polls this morning, which gave them 18 points.
And that makes them almost twice as strong as the Liberals. But of course percentages don't mean seats won, and the SNP know this better than anyone. In the 1970 result they had 11.4% of the vote, but returned only 1 MP. This time, naturally, they say it's all going to be different, and they may well be right. Because even if they didn't win any seats at all, a good half-dozen Labour seats in central Scotland, already made marginal by redistribution, now look very likely Tory gains as a result of SNP penetration. The Nationalists should also hold on to the once safely Labour Western Isles. And Mrs Margot MacDonald, the sensational by-election victor of Govan, should keep that from going back to Labour as well. With a couple of SNP gains from Labour possible in Dundee East and Stirling and Falkirk, they're poised to break up the whole pattern of Labour dominance in Scotland. Well, we can test all that later tonight. As for the extent of nationalist damage to the Conservatives, we'll be waiting for 3 archetypal Tory shires tomorrow and Saturday.
And the latest news from our poll being taken today at Watford while people were voting shows a 3.5% swing to Labour. That's a little bit higher than the first news that we gave from Watford. And so this appears to be the pattern from these straw polls taken today. Good news for Labour so far in the night, and of course good news too for the Liberals with their share of the poll. Now let's go down to Cardiff and Vincent Kane for news from there.
In Wales, Labour usually have the whip hand at elections. They held 28 of the 36 seats here at the dissolution, with the Conservatives holding 7 and the Liberals 1. But of those 7 Tory seats, 4, possibly 5, are susceptible to a swing of even 1% to Labour. But it's Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, that adds zest to elections in Wales. At the last by-election at Merthyr a couple of years ago, they nearly pulled off a sensation when they got within 3,000 of Labour in that traditional Labour stronghold. Dr. Ken Morgan is our analyst and expert down here. Do you think Plaid Cymru are going to do anything tonight?
It's certainly one of the main talking points in Wales, I think, Vincent. They're exploiting the impact of the Kilbrandon report, and in seats as different as a rural constituency like Carnarvon and an industrial constituency like Aberdare, I think Plaid are fighting to win tonight.
What about the Liberal challenge? Is that relevant here in Wales?
Well, it is. Certainly there is a Liberal upsurge, I think, but historically Liberalism in Wales is very different from that in the rest of the United Kingdom. We don't, for example, seem to have Orpington Man in Wales particularly. On the other hand, certainly there are prospects in Cardiganshire, for example, of a Liberal gain, and we'll be looking at the other rural seats too, I think, for this.
Are there any interesting boundary changes that might throw up a strange result?
The most interesting ones are Cardiff. There are 2, perhaps 3 marginal seats created as a result of redistribution. Other seats in South Wales are affected. On the whole, I think the Conservatives marginally benefit from
And are
this.
there any seats where we can be fairly sure that there will be a change tonight or tomorrow?
One pretty certain, I think Pembrokeshire, because affected by Desmond Donnelly's intervention last time. But on the whole, I think the evening will confirm that Wales is still very much a stronghold of the left.
So what we'll be looking out for in Wales when the results start coming through here at about 2 o'clock in the morning and then on into tomorrow, which is St David's Day, by the way, will be how far any third party, whether it's Plaid Cymru or the Liberals, have managed to challenge the 2 major parties, and especially that Labour grip on Wales.
And just to repeat that today's straw polls do suggest that Labour is doing well. Well, one place that the polls so far and our own computer can't really help us is Northern Ireland. Although 7 of the 12 constituencies are affected by boundary changes there, the real problem there, the real effect of any changes in the boundaries are submerged by changes of political boundaries since 1970. There's a completely new lineup of parties, and the real issue before the Ulster voters has not been power saving, but power sharing. And the election has been a test of support for the new Northern Ireland executive. We've grouped the parties into those in favour of the executive and those against, and no doubt Mr Francis Pym, who's been the Secretary for Northern Ireland, we're watching anxiously to see who gets the biggest share of today's vote. Well, none of the Northern Ireland seats reports until tomorrow, but if it's a close-run thing overnight tonight, the results in these 12 seats could be crucial. Only the pro-Assembly unionists can really be counted on to support Mr. Heath, and the betting tonight is that at least 6 anti-executive United Unionists will be returned to Westminster. Well, now we have, of course, also going on today, as well as the general election, there has been a local government by-election going on in Headingley in Leeds. And for news of that, let's go to Philip Hayton in Leeds.
What's happened in Headingley is that although the Conservatives have won, the Liberals have come a very good second. Unlike last time in 1973 when they came third, the percentage this time runs as follows: 36% to the Conservatives, 33% to the Liberals, and 30% to Labour. Philip Hayton in Leeds.
And so that is the situation in this local government election in Headingley, David. Seems to confirm what's happening elsewhere.
Well, that certainly is a very impressive result. It's near to an area of Leeds West where there is great hope for a Liberal victory if they are to make a win. Michael Meadowcroft there. I think it does encourage them. I must say that the net effect of all these polls is to make one believe that if there's anything in them, we are not going to get a clear majority tonight. It's going to be a long, hard night for all of us. We shall certainly be cautious and hedging our bets until we've got a lot more evidence than we have now. But it's already time to say that the Liberals seem to be going to do fully as well as the opinion polls this morning suggested, that still leaves them third.
And with the consequences to calculate, Bob.
Well, of course, the fascinating question is whether the Liberals get into their takeoff point. We've been saying all along around 25%. They begin to really make headway. Now, they're 30% on this poll. On a number of other straw polls, they've been around 25%. This could be the moment of great excitement for the Liberals, and it does look very much on this very fragile evidence so far, because we haven't actually had a real vote counted in the national election. It looks as if it's a close race, and every possibility of a kind of dead heat with nobody holding a clear majority.
And that, of course, makes it all the more important that we do get a real result in the general election. Although, of course, this result in Headingley in the local government by-election is a real result, all right, no difficulty about that. But we expect the results to start coming in after 11 o'clock. Of course, people race neck and neck to get them, and this time the result in the general election, well, it could really give the first clear indication of whether the polls are right or wrong, and which party leader can breathe again, or which party leader is going to have a really long, hard night, or perhaps all three of them. Well, from the reports that we've been getting from our men on the spot, the indications are that the count is going well, as it usually does, at Cheltenham and at Guildford. Both returning officers there have been saying today that they're confident that they'll be first on the air with the result. In all, our outside broadcast cameras will be bringing the declarations from 76 counts. It's part of the biggest and, we believe, the fastest results service of any general election to date. And while that machine with these results clicks into overdrive, I'm going to take a look back now at the campaign over the past 3 weeks through David Dimbleby's eyes before he left for Sidcup tonight.
Mr. Heath called this election on the issue of who governs the country, and in a few hours' time he'll have his answer. But as he waits for it, is he confident that the issues that he chose to fight on are the ones the electorate accepted as important? It started well enough with Mrs. Thatcher demonstrating cabinet solidarity on the issue of extremism.
I think in the unions and in the students' unions, and perhaps too in the parliamentary party itself, on the whole there has seemed to have been an increasing number of very left-wingers. Now, certainly I believe this is true in the unions. Most of us have been brought up on the idea that the communists have certain ways of operating. Certainly they have never, in fact, got very far in Parliament, but undoubtedly they have got very important places in the unions.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Meanwhile, the party workers were preparing for battle. The Liberals still had an army to recruit.
Easton, I understand you want to be a Liberal candidate.
Yes, indeed.
Each day's campaigning began with press conferences at the three-party headquarters. Visitors to the Liberals conference found that a disembodied Mr. Thorpe had remained in his marginal North Devon constituency and was beamed to metropolitan journalists via closed-circuit television. With the mechanics sorted out, the next question was, what was the election to be about? The Conservatives had made their position clear, but Mr. Wilson would have none of it. He chose to make his major issue prices, and within a few days, with the publication of the Retail Price Index, clearly felt his choice was vindicated. The campaign took off.
This man has got the country's priorities all wrong. Let Mr. Heath stop making excuses. Let him stop whining. It's not my fault the prices are going up or the mortgage interest rates. Please, sir, it wasn't me. Let him call off his search for whipping boys and scapegoats among trade unionists. Let him tell the facts to the British people and admit the responsibility.
Mr. Heath was unperturbed by Mr. Wilson's wrath. He discovered an ally, one of the few new faces in the campaign, a butcher from Perry Bar, Birmingham, who told him that people weren't grateful enough when prices eventually did go down.
We happen, the butcher and I, to agree on the same philosophy.
The butcher is Mr. Richard Islip, who manages a shop at King's Standing. He says that meat prices have fallen by about 7 pence a pound in the past 2 weeks, but complains that customers don't seem very grateful.
Most of them don't take any notice. It's just, you know, one of those things, a price is a price, whether it's up or down, but the moment it goes up, they complain about it.
So they don't congratulate you when it goes down?
No, definitely not.
It wasn't just the party leaders, though, who were slugging it out. Some of the more prominent politicians were very busy defending marginal seats. Mr. Robert Carr had to race round his constituency of Carshalton in Surrey, trying to whip up support. His Liberal opponent, a Mrs. Hester Smallbone, responded by marching round singing pop songs.
If we'd win Sutton Carshalton, we should be in a position to form a government, and actually I'm thrilled at the thought of a Liberal government, and I hope I'll be a member of it. This is tremendous.
What would you like to do if you became a member?
I have to ask Jeremy Thorpe that question.
At the end of week 2, all eyes were suddenly focused on the Liberals, who, far from being squeezed out, as the two main parties had hoped, seemed to be gaining ground daily.
This morning at their press conferences, Mr. Heath said that the new Liberal voters were all coming from the Labour Party, and Mr. Wilson said that they were all coming from the Conservative Party. I know where they're coming from. They are coming from the people.
Then the campaign took an odd turn. It was revealed to the pay board that the miners were apparently worse off compared with other workers in industry than had originally been thought. Their comparative pay had been differently calculated and included, the board was told, payments that were left out of calculations for other workers. Could it be that Mr. Heath's crisis election was, after all, unnecessary?
The news of the blunder over the miners' pay claim has now sunk in. The nation now knows the truth. More revelations today. The nation now knows that the 3-day week was never necessary.
Mr. Wilson said at different times today there had been a simple error, a serious arithmetical error, and that figures were seriously wrong, and that the country is bewildered and confused. In fact, he knows perfectly well that there has been no error of any kind. The figures used were in the same October analysis and on the same basis as he himself used in his government when he was Prime Minister.
I think it is absolutely staggering, particularly when it is an issue upon which the government indicated it was necessary to have a general election. Call a general election on the issue and then discover that your figures are wrong afterwards. This is a pure Alice in Wonderland situation.
For one man, however, there was no doubt about the truth behind this election. Mr. Enoch Powell described it as a fraud and withdrew. The retirement was brief, and with only a few days to go before polling, Mr. Powell re-emerged into the spotlight to urge his supporters to vote Labour, a remark which prompted one of them to call him a Judas.
Judas was paid. Judas was paid. I am making a sacrifice.
A brief look at the shortest election campaign since the war. To end with, let's hear again from someone who found the whole thing dreadfully inconvenient. For Mrs. Ernley Money, wife of the Tory candidate at Ipswich, the election couldn't have come at a worse time.
It's all been an awful muddle because with the election being on the 28th and Rosie carving early, she was meant to carve on the 14th. And that's thrown us all a lot because we weren't expecting her to. And so we've had milk everywhere. And we're making butter and we're making cheese. And we don't know what we're doing with the milk. And it's made it very complicated.
Well, some of the moments of the election battle are seen from the great men and the view of some of the troops. The count is, of course, going on now, and we have at both Cheltenham and Guildford high excitement to see who is going to be first in this particular race. Information there's a high turnout at Cheltenham. 80% of the voters there apparently have voted today, compared with 75% at the last election. But now here's a serious question. What kind of campaign has it been for the party leaders themselves? They, of course, have been in the forefront of the battle. They've taken all the pain and all the kicks and few of the halfpence. Here's Mike Yarwood.
Well, I can honestly say this has been one of my most successful campaigns. Wherever I went, wildly cheering fans have showered me with flowers. In fact, it's been a bit like a Dorothy Squires concert tour. And consequently, I feel quite sure you will see me voted in as your next government. In fact, I feel so confident that I've just sent Mary out to buy 6 bottles of Celebration champagne on sale or return. It has also been said that this campaign has developed into a sordid slanging match between the 2 main party leaders. Rubbish. This is just a vicious rumour spread by that pompous Popeye with the performing shoulders. He has also smugly said that the Liberals carry no weight. He wouldn't sound so cocky if Cyril Smith sat on him. And I wish he would. During this campaign, I have spoken to housewives at great length. In fact, most of them haven't been able to get a word in edgeways. But I sympathise with them because under the Tories, food has risen 53%, which means 15 pence on a pint of bitter, which in turn has led to many bank managers saying to many heavy-drinking customers, there's a terrific overdraft in here. I was in a supermarket only yesterday, and I saw this old lady counting her pittance to see if she could afford the tin she held in her hand. But she couldn't, so she put it back on the shelf, which was a blessing in disguise, really, because it was the last one in the shop and I wanted it. Rather fond of pilchards. And of course, I shall be making a few changes. For instance, I shall be coming down very heavily on the property speculators. At least I will as soon as I've had time to sell my 3 houses and move into Centre Point. I shall also nationalise the oil in the North Sea. I shall slap such a high... I'm very tired. I shall slap such a high import duty on it that the oil slicks will be afraid to come ashore. And finally, though I'm not one to make predictions, let me just read a couple of lines Mary has written with regard to this contest. I am the greatest, I'll be your PM. I promise I'll get Ted out of number 10. But finally, before I go, no, don't go yet. Let me say in the words of Huey Green that during the BBC's excellent coverage of the election results, Robert Mackenzie's swingometer is only for fun. It's your votes that really count, folks. I thought that went very...
Well, Mike Yarwood with some thoughts about Mr. Wilson during the campaign. Just a light moment in some of the agony, and its real agony, of course, of waiting. But in accordance with BBC's propriety, Mr. Heath.
Ahoy there, my shipmates. As you probably know, I am still your Prime Minister, so there. And I'm very confident that tonight I shall be re-elected, so much so that you won't find a furniture van outside number 10. I've asked the driver to keep driving round the block for a few hours. During our campaign, I've thoroughly enjoyed my casual walk-arounds, though I'll admit in 1 or 2 areas I did have to quicken my pace a little. During this tour, my statisticians tell me that I was asked 14,876 different questions. They also tell me that I only slipped up twice and gave inadvertently direct answers. Well, the response was terrific. In fact, everybody in Leeds said they would vote for me, all except one. But then, of course, Jess Yates has always been jealous of my organ playing. And in South Wales, in order that I might see conditions for myself, a group of miners tried to persuade me down a deep mine shaft. But luckily, I managed to step aside just in time. But let's face it, the miners aren't the only ones who spend most of their lives in the dark. Half the time, I don't know what's going on either. And I think I've been very sporting towards Harold in this campaign. I've even sent Enoch Powell round telling everybody to vote Labour. And he must have been convincing because he's even had Anthony Barber in 2 minds. But then, of course, Anthony Barber is always in two minds. But how has the campaign gone? Well, there's talk of Liberal success. But of course, Jeremy Thorpe can't possibly become Prime Minister. It would ruin Mike Yarwood's act. He can't do him, you know. In fact, come to think of it, he doesn't do me pretty well either. During this campaign, Harold has tried to make an election issue of the common market. But it's not the terms that really annoy him. What really gets up his nose is that I refuse to make the Scilly Isles one of the 6. He also complains about restrictions of phase 3. But it's a well-known fact that he was only too pleased to settle within its limits when Mrs. Wilson asked for a housekeeping rise. I admit the cost of living has risen, but I have no control over world prices, and I've even less control over ours. Harold says he'll reduce prices by increasing taxes, which I'm all for. I mean, you can never get one in the rush hour outside number 10. Have you ever found that, Alistair? It's absolutely murder trying to get a taxi. Really, you can't get a taxi. Terrible. Hello, Robin.
Well, Mike Yarwood will be staying with us tonight. He'll be joining Michael Barrett for our breakfast programme, which starts at 6 o'clock tomorrow. Well, now a word about some of the words that we will be using tonight. We'll be using some variations of the usual language of election programmes. For instance, we'll be referring to old and to new seats. New seats are those where the boundaries have been altered significantly, where a sizable number of voters have been moved from one constituency to another. There are about 350 of them, and let's take the London Borough of Havering as one example. Well, since the 1970 election, the old overcrowded constituencies of Hornchurch and Romford have been carved up into 3. A new constituency, Upminster, has been created, and this sort of thing has happened all over the country. Nationwide, there'll be 5 more seats this time than in 1970, 5 more MPs in the House of Commons. To get some idea of which party benefits from the boundary changes and who's gaining ground in the new seats, the BBC Election Unit has made an extensive study of the movements of voters. For each new seat, we've measured how similar it is to the old one it replaces and the voting patterns of the people who've been moved. Now, back to our example of Havering. Hornchurch was Conservative last time, Romford Labour. In fact, they were both fairly close. Hornchurch Conservative by 8% and Romford Labour by only 5%. Now, with the new boundaries, we find that Hornchurch loses many Tory voters and Romford many Labour voters to the new Upminster. Clearly, if the new boundaries had existed in 1970, Hornchurch would have been Labour, Romford would have been Conservative, and the completely new seat of Upminster would have been, well, almost exactly 50-50 Labour and Conservative. It's so close, we can't say with certainty who would have won last time. It's one of a dozen seats, too close to call. You'll see Devon North amongst those, Jeremy Thorpe's seat. By any mathematical calculation, he must have lost last time. But who can say his personal vote would have been enough to get him through then? For all new seats like these, we've come up with the party we presume would have won in 1970. In most of them, when the name's the same, so is the party. But in 17, like Romford and Hornchurch, it's the other party. These seats appear to have been turned upside down or inverted. This way, a number of well-known MPs will be in danger unless the tide goes their way. Judith Hart in Lanark, Philip Whitehead in Derby North, and Harold Soref in Ormskirk. Shirley Williams got out of Hitchin. She's not exactly defecting. She's gone with 40,000 of her voters to the new Hertford and Stevenage. Across the country as a whole, the effect of the boundary changes is to give the Tories quite an advantage. This is mainly because several underpopulated city seats held by Labour have disappeared, and there are more seats in the commuting suburbs that generally vote Tory. Mr. Heath gets a start of about 11 seats over Mr. Wilson compared with 1970. And in a close finish, the effects of the boundary changes could make all the difference. This was the result in 1970. If the new boundaries had existed then, the Conservatives would have had 8 more seats, Labour 3 fewer. So that's where we begin tonight, and we'll be counting the gains and losses from that start point. And so that was the situation then. We'd better clear that scoreboard up, I think, now. Right back to the start, and with all still to play for. To gain power outright tonight, Labour needs to make a total of 28 gains in the old and new seats, and we will be bringing those all in together. Mr. Heath can afford 26 losses before he actually loses power, and the Liberals need to make at least 200 gains if they intend to be the largest single party. And as well as a little new language, we shall also be working with another new friend, the BBC computer. The only bit you'll see during the night is down there behind me, where the results editor and his team are selecting from their bank of monitors the result with the highest priority when each result comes in. And that should be on your screen within 45 seconds of the telephone call which brings us the result from the constituency count. Well, now we have some news, quite serious news from Belfast. Let us go there, Don Anderson.
Well, Belfast has been hit by a bombing blitz during the last 2 hours of polling. One man has died and 2 other people have been injured, one of them critically. There have been 12 explosions since 9 o'clock, most of them in the Belfast city central area. A man was killed and a woman lost both legs when a bomber hurled explosives into a dockside pub just over an hour ago. Car bombs, at least 5 of them, have damaged shop and office property in several streets close to Belfast city centre. The latest explosion reported only a short time ago was in a public house on the outskirts of the city at Temple Patrick. It's not known yet whether there were any casualties in this last explosion, nor is it known which terrorist organisation or organisations were responsible for this. Now back to the studio in London.
And that is life in Ulster, everyday life, every day, apparently, election life in Ulster. Well, now here we have a situation that the polls taken today in these constituencies are now completed. And David Butler, what are the conclusions that you draw from them?
The later results confirm the swing to Labour. The last votes cast after 9 o'clock must have been more Labour, and the average swing over the 3 seats is 2.2% to Labour, just about enough to put Labour in power if the Liberals weren't getting anywhere. But the Liberals on these 3 seats, none of them particularly promising territory, have averaged 23.4% of the vote. And one other piece of hot news that has come in, and that is turnout figures. We've got our first hard figure, and in Guildford, one of the racing seats, 80.4% turnout. That's up 8.3% on last time. And we've had reports from Cheltenham and Devon which indicate an increase in turnout of at least 5% in those seats too.
So, perhaps that increase in turnout is making a difference. These are Liberals perhaps showing their teeth?
They may be Liberals showing their teeth. We shan't know until we've got quite a lot more in, of course, whether this upsurge in the Liberals has taken votes more from the Conservatives than from Labour, or whether there is actually a swing to Labour from the Conservatives and the Liberals are taking votes equally from the 2 parties. That, the computer you've just been talking about, will help us to sort out in the next couple of hours.
Well, we'll be getting there. Let's see how, in fact, they're getting on with the counting. Let's go around the country, and first to Cheltenham and Martin Young.
Well, Cheltenham, of course, is a horse racing town, Alistair, and tonight they say they're a safe bet to be first with the declaration. For the last 3 elections, they've been first twice, and they hope that this will be a first for them again. They've got 144 people out there counting the votes, and as you've mentioned already, it's a very high poll. In fact, well over 80%, we're told. This is Martin Young in Cheltenham.
And,
but last time Guildford was first in 1970, and this time it could be the same because all the ballot boxes were in some 3 minutes early, and the returning officer is still hoping for first return this time, and all eyes will be to see where that 14,000 majority of last time that Mr. David Howell, the Conservative, goes to this time. Paul Griffiths in Guildford.
Well, traditionally, Salford West is one of the first horses past the declaration post. We've just heard that all the votes are in, and it's a high poll, 72%. That's 10% more than at the last general election in 1970. Traditionally, this is a Labour seat. Stanhorn held it for Labour. They've had the seat for 45 years. Last time, his majority was only 2,600. That was a straight fight with the Conservatives. This time, there's a Liberal in the field for the first time in 40 years, and within half an hour we should know what impact that Liberal has had. Gerald Harrison, Salford West.
Well, an unconfirmed figure for Newcastle Central is 65% turnout. But even if every voter in this constituency turned out, that's the 26,000 of them, it would still be one of the smallest constituencies in the country. But it's still a very important one, because the Labour candidate here is their deputy leader, Mr. Edward Short. Well, we're expecting the declaration here at about 11:30. Jake Kelly in Newcastle Central.
And one of those 4 could very easily be the first in very few moments' time. But at this stage, of course, we have no results in. Plenty of prognostications, but no results so far. Everything still to play for at 5 minutes to 11. And that's what the party leaders face now. And I suppose this is just at the moment when the election is really reaching its first decisive moment. Well, now for news of the southeast, Robert Mackenzie.
Well, here's where we'll be looking at the battle in the home counties and in London on a separate map in a moment. And of course, it's a fascinating area in one sense because we had our last regional poll report which said that the Tories were far ahead in London and the southeast. Our own polling data may throw some doubt upon that because it seems to suggest a strong Labour comeback. We'll see what happens later on. But in this region, of course, the home counties, of course, traditionally Tory with only 7 Labour seats, which you can see marked on the chart. The most interesting of these to watch, I think, from our point of view, are Hertford and Stevenage, where Mrs. Shirley Williams is battling, in Eton and Slough, where Steve Dolland is hoping to unseat Joan Lester, and then others such as the remoter areas here, which could also be very vulnerable to a Liberal swing if that happens. We'll be watching in a Con Lab swing. If there's a swing to Labour, then Gravesend, Dover and Deal, Oxford, Buckingham might go, where, of course, the attempt is being made for a comeback by a very famous former Labour MP. If the swing is the other way, toward the Conservatives, then these are the seats Labour held which would be in serious danger. What happened, of course, is anyone's guess. At recent by-elections, no seat could be considered safe where a Liberal is standing. And going by today's NOP poll of London and the South East, it may be the Liberals who make the most news. The poll puts the Liberals half of 1% behind Labour, 29 to 29.5%. If they get that sort of vote, the map of London could be greatly changed too. Now, at the moment, London's 92 seats are fairly evenly divided between Labour and Conservative. One seat, Sutton and Cheam, which was a 1970 Conservative seat, was, of course, won by a Liberal at a by-election. That's Graham Tope. He won Sutton and Cheam in the 1972 by-election when he turned a 12,500 Conservative majority in Sutton into a bit like an assault 12,500 majority for the Liberals. If there's a strong swing for the Liberals, then seats like Richmond could fall. And almost certainly, there, Anthony Royal, defending an 8,000 Conservative majority, could have a battle on his hands. Then there's Orpington, where in 1962, Eric Lubbock, now Lord Avebury, started the Liberal revival in the South East. Anyway, Liberals or no Liberals, there are still many marginal seats where the battles of the last 3 weeks between Labour and Conservative candidates have been intense. Brentford and Isleworth, a new seat where 2 MPs find themselves face to face. Barney Hayhoe, the old Conservative MP for Isleworth, and Michael Barnes, the former Labour MP for Brentford. On our calculations, Brentford and Isleworth should go Labour, and there's a 3% if there's a 3% swing to Labour. And all these, of course, are the others involved. If there's a swing to Labour of 1%, then these Tory seats are in grave danger. If the swing goes the other way, then these are Labour seats, which are in grave danger. So we'll see what happens when we get the first returns in those areas. Alistair.
And the situation at the polls tonight are good news for Labour and Liberals. The polls this morning, good news for the Tories and Liberals. Let's see what the punters think, and Julian Wilson at Ladbrokes.
And the news here in betting terms is a swing back to Labour because having gone out to as much as 7-2 earlier this evening, Cyril Steen, the chairman at the dinner table, he laid a bet of £3,000 at 7-2. So now the odds have shortened as follows. And since you were last with us, there's been accumulation of bets on Labour as well. Shortening them from 5-2 as it was then down to 9-4. That was following the report of the straw poll earlier in this programme. So now the Conservatives, who were 5-1 on, they're now 3-1 on. The big bet was for Labour, remember, at the dinner table, £3,000 at 7-2. They're down to 9-4. The Liberals are 100-1 still, while over at William Hill's it's 11-4 on Conservatives, 2-1 against Labour, and 33-1 the Liberals. Cyril Steen and Ron Pollard, the odds makers, here poised for the first results, and when those results come through, we can expect a real major change in the betting.
Well, that's one of the upsets and a late move in the market. I don't know whether we got time to get in or not, David.
Well, we've had solid votes from people. We've got between 4 and 8% more people voting in this critical election than any before. The indications, which are not from the real voters, those are from the real voters, are that there's a swing to Labour.
All right, well, we'll see whether the results really bring that out, and we should be getting them in just a few moments from now. And with 635 results to come, we're not making any predictions on any results because we haven't had any, but we are saying that at the moment the polls taken today do suggest that Labour is in with a shout at the moment. And of course we're waiting for the first results to come, perhaps from Cheltenham or Guildford, Salford, Newcastle, perhaps Wolverhampton, and maybe as soon as 5 minutes from now. And then the facts will really be coming clear. For the moment, I think we have a chance now to go to Robin Day, who is entertaining.
Well, with me are three well-informed political observers. Patrick Jenkins, columnist of The Guardian, Anthony Howard, editor of The New Statesman, Patrick Cosgrave, political editor of The Spectator. Gentlemen, you've heard what's been going on. No results, but 3 straw polls in marginal seats which suggest a swing to Labour. How do you read the situation?
Well, I'm Peter Jenkins, Robin. Patrick Jenkins is the one who cleaned his teeth in the dark.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. That's not a very good start on my part, but thank you for correcting me.
Now, what's interesting, I think, about these straw polls, and they've tended to be rather accurate in the past, but on the figures, the earlier figures, the detailed ones which David Butler gave us, are of a reverse of what the opinion polls have been suggesting in one sense, and that is that Labour is doing rather better in the south than in the north. Now, I suspect that from the latest swing figure he gave us, the Labour figure must have come up in Halifax. But I mean, I think that this does really put a completely new complexion on the election if Labour is doing well in the south. Also, these figures do suggest that the Liberal support is evenly spread around the country. And if so, I know that the Liberals tonight have had a computer, they have their computer which has been at work on this, and on this sort of swing they are predicting themselves 44 seats, and in which case it points to a minority government, doesn't it?
Thank you. Peter. Tony Howard.
Well, I have the impression that we're in for a very exciting night. We may be in for a night, the one you remember, Robin, like 1964, when we sweated it out to, what was it, about 2:45 on Friday afternoon. I don't rule that out at all. What I must say gives me some kind of pleasure is that it seems to me, as of now, if these polls are right, the real casualties of the election are going to be those people who told us how we were going to vote. I'm talking about the opinion poll merchants. And I would find it very healthy for democracy that they really got a black eye. This time there can be no excuses. The trend was all going. They went on polling to the end. If they are wrong, and I don't know, because these are straw polls, if they are wrong, I for one will rejoice.
Do you smell a Labour victory?
I think I get a scent of a Labour victory. And oddly enough, I got that earlier in the day when I listened to what the poll had been throughout the country. And if it is going to be an 80% poll, then you and I know that we've always believed in it, maybe folklore, this does help the Labour Party when the middling and inferior sort of people come out to vote.
Patrick Cosgrave, what are your feelings of what little we know now?
Like Peter and Tony, I'm certain that those straw polls are far superior as predictors of what's going to happen than the national opinion polls which appear in the daily papers. I've thought throughout this campaign that Labour were almost certain to win it. And on these figures, the Liberals are not doing quite well enough to make a major breakthrough. I think we'll have a Labour government tomorrow.
Do you think the Liberals are going to hold the balance of power? Do you think that's a
Well, they might. I mean, obviously, if you try to even out both the polls in the newspapers and the straw polls we've seen this evening, the odds would be on a minority government.
Now, from your knowledge of politics, supposing we get this kind of situation, do you think that either Mr. Heath or Mr. Wilson, whoever has the marginal addition of votes to make them in the lead, do you think they're more likely to govern as best they can, or try to form a minority coalition on the Canadian style?
They won't govern at all. I mean, I'm quite sure what will happen. That the Prime Minister will say, I am in charge of the Queen's government. Until I am defeated, I shall remain Prime Minister. And we'll go back to the 1923-24 situation, and he will challenge the Liberals to defeat him. If they do hold the balance of power, he will say, oh, come on then, are you going to precipitate a second general election? Think about the pound, gentlemen. Yes, I don't see him resigning and going to the palace at all.
I think it's very important to remember that even if Labour finish as the biggest party in the House of Commons, Mr. Heath remains as Prime Minister, and there's no obligation whatever on him to resign until he's beaten in the House of Commons.
In any case, I think we're jumping two hurdles before that time here, because it's obviously going to be very much influenced by how narrow that majority is, how small a minority government it is. I mean, if one or other of the major parties finds themselves with a majority of 2 over the other major party, then the situation is clearly quite different than if the Liberals hold the balance by 1 vote or something of that kind. So I think we should leave that until later in the evening.
Yes. If this sort of situation does arise, do you see any real chance of a coalition?
No, not a formal coalition. Everybody has said no, and I think that they mean it. And I think also the Liberals mean it. I think the Liberals are going to keep their own council for several days if there's a close result.
I see a de facto. The Liberals are more likely to support the Conservatives than to support Labour.
I see a de facto coalition, Robin, in this sense that Mr. Thorpe has to do nothing if Mr. Heath says, I'm staying in power. He doesn't have to do any positive act. If, on the other hand, he wants Mr. Wilson to go in, he actually has to throw his troops on that side. That's the difference.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Alistair?
Well, there we have the discussion about what might happen if it's a very narrow decision tonight and tomorrow, as it could very well be, given the straw polls that we have so far. Let's go and see what the count is like at Wolverhampton, which is also very much in this horse race to be first past the post, and Philip Tibbenham.
2 for the price of 1 here at the Civic Hall in Wolverhampton. On the left of your picture, Rennie Short's constituency, which must now be considered marginal with changes in boundaries, but even more fascinating on the right-hand side, Enoch Powell's former constituency, and nobody's taking any bets at all on what might happen there as a result of his remarkable behaviour. A very heavy poll here. It's said even between 85 and 90%. They're talking about a result in about half an hour, but frankly, I believe that when I see it. Philip Tibbenham at Wolverhampton.
Well, while we're waiting now, David, I think a declaration is imminent really now. So far, then, the polls have changed. They've said 2 things. They said something this morning, they said something this evening.
Well, it's a different sort of poll this evening. These are interviews with about 3,000 people as they came out of the polls in 3 constituencies, 1 in the south, 1 in the west, and 1 in the north, and they show a 2.2% swing to Labour, the sort of thing that would just put Labour back in power if there wasn't an increased Liberal vote. But they also show a Liberal vote of between 23 and 24%, and that would point to something in the region of 20 to 30 Liberal seats. There the arithmetic gets very dicey.
Because they're just at the point of takeoff, where they might really do very great things if they did above that in some parts of the country.
Yes, and we're fairly sure that their success will be fairly unevenly spread. And so we, I think, are going to be hesitating for much longer tonight than we've ever hesitated before to say what the final outcome is in the election.
So we'd better advise everybody to sit up a bit and perhaps get a cup of tea and lay in the drink if you're that way inclined, because the forecast is it's going to be a long night before we can be really sure, at least on such evidence as we have so far. But let's go now to Guildford, which seems to be ahead in the race at the moment, at least so we understand. Paul Griffiths is there.
And in Guildford, there's certainly a real air of electric excitement here as Mr. Sam Weller, who's just spread his hands, is about to go over to collect the figures. There's just been a small amount of deliberation, just to let you know that the indications are that the Liberals have really jumped up here. Last time the Liberal vote was almost 9,000. It looks as though it's been doubled this time to something over 18,000. We'll find that out in just a moment. Mr. Weller, if I may just mention a word about him, the returning officer, before we receive the figures from him, is retiring after this, his 8th general election count, and he said he's definitely retiring this time. He said it last time, but he is in fact tomorrow 4 weeks retiring from his job as town clerk here in Guildford, and this will be definitely his last stand on election night. And the sitting member here, of course, is David Howell, Conservative David Howell, who has been closely associated with Mr. Heath's style of government. Mr. Howell was the junior Minister of State for Northern Ireland under William Whitelaw, and he is now the Minister of State for Energy under Lord Carrington. Last time he had a 14,000 majority. This time, if that majority has been slimmed down, it looks as though it has gone to the Liberals. We'll wait and see the figures in just a moment. They're writing them down. Mr. Weller is leaning over the table, the final returning officer's table, and coming to the microphone now. Not quite, but he's almost there for Guildford.
Ladies and gentlemen, I, being the Deputy Acting Returning Officer for the Guildford constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate in the election was as follows. Jean Elizabeth Crowe, 11,175. Christopher Jonathan Fox, 18,261. David Arthur Russell Howell, 28,152. And I declare that David Arthur Russell Howell has been duly elected to serve the Guildford constituency.
And there's an 80.5% turnout in Guildford, that's up 8%. The Liberals, coming up to second place, have increased their vote by 13.8%, 31.7.
Guildford tonight has shown clear Conservative common sense. And I believe that the nation will, in the next 24 hours, follow its example. I think it is right that I should, first of all, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and you, Mr. Deputy Returning Officer. You, Mr. Deputy Returning Officer, for your achievement in getting such a very speedy result. This is a remarkable achievement, and we congratulate you on it.
The mayor has nothing to do with it. The mayor has nothing to do with it. No.
So we should say well done to you, Mr. Deputy Returning Officer, but not only to you, but to all your staff who have fulfilled a most magnificent programme, who have worked with amazing speed and have done excellently in conducting this election. I congratulate them as well most warmly.
Well, this was the historic seat that told Mr. Heath he was going to be Prime Minister in 1970. It's rather a different answer tonight.
But, in fact, the Liberals, who've jumped up by 13.8, have taken slightly more votes from the Labour Party than the Conservatives. Labour is down 7.2%, the Conservatives are down 6.4%, but the Conservatives have got less than half the votes for the first time for a very long while in the Guildford constituency.
So this really does put the balance of power situation very much in the forefront.
It puts it very much in the forefront. I do think that, though, I can't project. Remember last time I say, if the whole country behaves like Guildford, then Mr. Heath will be back with an appreciably increased majority. On this, I have to say, if the whole country behaves like this, we've got to wait for a lot more results.
All right, now, Robert Mackenzie, are you going to wait for a long time?
Well, the swingometer now is in big trouble because the real swing is to the Liberals, and it's a very minor technical swing to the Conservatives between Conservatives and Labour, so we're perhaps in that area, which is the area of great uncertainty. But the real swing is the Liberals, and we're going to have to enlarge our projected possible Liberal seats, I think, quite considerably here. Early days, first result, but at the moment it certainly looks as if we might be in that deadlock situation with the Liberals holding the balance of power.
Now, there are a number of seats in and around London in this kind of suburb where the Liberals could expect to do very well on that result.
Yes, indeed. I would now say that our southeast chart may begin to change quite dramatically with Liberals picking up a number of seats in the southeast area.
Well, there's the result from Guildford, and it's rather a muddy one at the moment. We can't be sure which way it's going. Nobody can be confident, but of course there are 634 horses coming up towards the post. One of those is from Cheltenham, and let's go now to Cheltenham and Martin Young.
Well, the situation here at Cheltenham seems to be rather similar to Guildford. As far as one can judge at this stage, the Liberal may come into second place from third place last year, where he was down to 8,000 votes last time there was an election. We don't know yet how long it's going to be before they actually do report here on the full declaration, but we know why they've been held up. They unfortunately had one ballot box lost, and they had to find it and bring it in. So that's why they're late, and that's why, sadly, they're not the first this year, but they are hoping within a few minutes to declare the result. We'll have to tell you exactly when later on. Martin Young in Cheltenham.
So, with Cheltenham still just a few moments away, but obviously pretty close and just coming up, and with the news that Mr. David Howe back at Guildford, And obviously, from what he said, anxious to continue in government and believing that he still has a chance to be there. The Liberal who did so well there, getting 31% of the vote, is a chartered accountant, Mr. Chris Fox. He's aged only 26, and his experience of politics probably not very great. Well, now, Robin Day again.
Well, I have with me here three noble guests who's had the good fortune or misfortune not to have to fight in this election. Lord Windlesham, Lord Privy Seal, Lord Avebury, formerly Eric Lubbock, Vice Chairman of the Liberal Party, and Lord Davis of Leek, formerly a very articulate and well-known member of the House of Commons in the Labour Party. Lord Windlesham, you didn't look very happy during that Guildford result, and you don't look very happy now.
On the contrary, I was delighted to see the first real result coming through after all these predictions. Polls, even after the real election has come to an end, when people are waiting to see what the result is. The result at Guildford was good for us, and most interesting, one of the most notable members of the government, David Howell, who did so well with Willie Whitehall in Northern Ireland, is returned. A very liberal character, incidentally. It shows there are liberals in all parties, not just in one.
But granted that David Howell won, and it would indeed be a tragedy for you if Guildford was lost, did not get won by a Conservative, but can you see any hope from the Guildford result, which was such an indicator last time of Mr. Heath getting his clear mandate?
Well, it's a mistake to start talking about clear mandates and to read the result of an election into the first result from one constituency.
All right, we won't do that. Eric Lubbock, you look a little more cheerful.
Well, I was very pleased with that result, although, as David Windlesham says, you can't read anything into one result. It was an extremely good poll for Chris Fox. The highest ever Liberal vote on record for this constituency was 37.6% in 1929, and Chris Fox, who is an extremely good candidate, but fighting somebody with great personality and strength, as David Windlesham has said, I think he did outstandingly well, and I expect to see this kind of result repeated in a great many constituencies.
Now, unlike most of our guests in these little talks, you have your computer with you, I see.
I have a little calculator.
Your personal calculator. If this result, is Liberal result, is repeated all over the country, do you have an idea, or your own view, as to how many seats Liberals might get?
Oh, well, if 31.7% would give us a very large number of seats, and my calculations don't extend up that far, but I think this was a seat where we expected to do rather well.
100 seats?
Oh, well over that. I mean,
yes.
29% we get 117 seats.
Yeah, you hopeful of holding the balance of power now, are you?
It's a possibility still at this stage.
Well, Lord Davis of Leek, what do you make of it?
Well, there's nothing to be pontifical about. Guildford isn't a piece of political litmus paper like some other seats. I could tell you who would win Guildford without having either computers or without the swingometer. But I agree here with my colleagues. It's too soon to prognosticate and try and say the result, but nevertheless, from your point of view, Eric, this is very interesting. I don't see you getting seats. I take you back to the 1929 election, and I'll give you the possibility of a balance of power. But if Wilson can get a majority of 3, we'll carry on for a couple of years with a majority of 3 come the Liberals, hellfire or deep water. But there's nothing yet to make me feel that there's a Conservative government anywhere in the distance.
Robin, I'm interested to know why you think...
Just a moment, I've got to go back to Alistair Burnett, I think. Sorry.
Because we are going back to Guildford just to have a word with the first winner of the night, David Howell, and Paul Griffiths is speaking to him.
Well, David Howell, you have been returned with the same figures that you had last time, but the Liberals have doubled up. Now, is this a piece of litmus paper for the rest of the country, do you see, tonight and tomorrow?
Well, I don't think so. My majority was slightly larger. I think this is a very substantial Conservative victory, as I thought it would be here. And, of course, it's very difficult to predict the outcome of this election with the various changes, but I would say that if we go this way, then we'll get the substantial working majority that our government needs for the future.
You must be concerned about that doubling up of Liberal votes here in Guildford, as you were an indicator last year of what eventually happened. Do you see that this could be the case this year?
Well, I think it's very, very hard to tell. It varies. I mean, the Liberals put in an immense effort here. there was a great deal of ballyhoo, and obviously it was right to expect there would be an increased Liberal vote. But if you ask me to make predictions, I mean, I'm not a computer, and I simply can't give predictions to the future on what this all means.
You're working very closely at the moment with Lord Carrington on energy. What do you see in terms of the miners' strike and the situation vis-à-vis the miners at this time with your victory here tonight? What does it indicate there?
I think it's too early to start making any statements of that kind. This is the very first result, which has been a magnificent work for the Deputy Returning Officer here to get the first result, Guildford, and I think we should be satisfied with that for the time being.
David Howell, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
And with Cheltenham short of a ballot box, although they found it now, but a little bit handicapped in the race, it's possible that Newcastle will come up next. And let's go therefore over to Newcastle Central, which is of course the seat of Mr. Edward Short, the Deputy Labour leader, and Jake Kelly is there.
Well, as in Newcastle Central, there's very little possibility of a Liberal swing. But here we're counting, we're about, I understand, about 5 minutes away from declaration. Mr. Short doesn't look very worried when he's standing on the floor here, but we're still hanging on. We lost a ballot box as well, and that has delayed us. But we'll know from the High Sheriff of Newcastle in about 5 minutes who has retained or won the seat in Newcastle Central. This is Jake Kelly in Newcastle Central.
And we all seem to be a little backward in coming forward. This terrible loss of ballot boxes around the country, it looks a little bit ominous. However, everything is in fact seems to be in order now, both at Newcastle and indeed at Cheltenham, which we're waiting for. Let's see how they're getting on now at Salford, and I think Salford West is the first we expect with Gerald Harrison.
Salford West, in fact, is the first we expect. 5 or 6 minutes is the estimate here for the declaration. The count for Salford East is going on in an adjoining room. That should follow shortly afterwards. We're told that we've not lost the race to get the first declaration in Salford. They say they don't race, they just try and do an efficient job and then go home as quickly as possible. Now, the way things are going, it looks as though Labour have done pretty well. It looks as though Stanor may well have kept his seat. You remember he's only got a 2,676 majority from 1970 when it was a straight fight with the Conservatives. This time there's a Liberal in the field for the first time in 40 years, but there seem to be smiles on the faces of the Labour supporters at this stage. We should know more in 5 or 6 minutes from now. Back to you.
Well, the smile on the face of the Labour supporters there, that doesn't come, I imagine, by chance. And on the very, very small swing which turned up between the two main parties at Guildford, I would have thought that on those circumstances Labour could be reasonably confident in Salford. However, these are still very early days. Let's have a word now with Robert Mackenzie about the battleground and how it's shaping up.
Well, this is, of course, what we call the battleground, because these are the seats most at risk. These are the Conservative seats most at risk if there's a swing to Labour. These are the Labour seats most at risk if there's a swing to the Conservatives. Now, what actually appeared to be a slight swing to the Conservatives from Labour in the Guildford result of ½ percentage point, that would put at risk these Labour-held seats and leave the Conservatives back nationally with a majority over Labour of about 75. Equally, if later on, when the swing settles down, it went to Labour, then ½ percentage point, that direction would knock out these Conservative-held seats in all probability and still leave the Conservatives with something like a 45 majority over Labour. And the same thing applies, still a majority of the Conservatives, but these seats going down if there is a swing to Labour. Now, I still want to look, however, at this exciting business of what the Liberals are going to do. We've been listing here the Liberal hopes, the ones they hold at present, a number of them, the ones they should take, a number of them here, such as Devon North now, and David Steele's seat here. And this is the area they're almost certain now to be picking up and holding seats in that sort of proportion, 26 in all. But the great thing is the possible takeoff. If they manage to get 20 to 25 to 30% of the vote, they'll shoot up from 20 up to 150 seats. Alistair?
And let's go now to Salford West, where I think we're coming up to a result.
Well, as you see, there's a huddle there with the Mayor of Salford, the returning officer, Councillor Harry Williams, and in front of him, the town clerk, Roger Rees. He says he's the man who says they like to do an efficient job and then go home. It looks as though they've done their efficient job, and very shortly we shall know whether Stan Orme has kept his seat in Salford West, the one that he's held for 10 years and which he's successfully defended twice. His majority last time was 2,676. There is the presence of that Liberal man today, but here is the Mayor of Salford with the result.
I, Harry Williams, being the returning officer of the Salford West constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Albert Edward Arstow,
Liberal,
5,591. Stanley Orme,
Labour,
16,808. Geoffrey Nicholas Lewis Tillett,
Conservative,
10,346. And that the undermentioned person, Stanley Orme, has been duly elected to serve as member for the said West constituency.
Friends, I would like, first of all, to thank the returning officer and everybody that's worked to make this election so efficient. But above all, I want to thank my supporters.
6%, 5.7% swing to Labour in the first northern seat, the second seat we've heard from tonight. The Liberals got 17% of the vote, well above saving their deposits, but not a real breakthrough. The Conservatives were down 14.1, Labour was down 2.8, so in fact either the Liberals were taking all their votes from the Conservatives in this traditional Labour seat, or alternatively there was a big swing from Conservative to Labour, and the Liberals were taking their votes equally.
And that's Stan Orme back, a member of the Engineering Union and left-wing on most issues, except perhaps Northern Ireland. He's been the member for Salford West since 1964. This was the more vulnerable of the Salford seats. The fact that Stan Orme has held it in quite such a substantial way means that Frank Allorne's seat next door now doesn't seem to be in any particular danger. However, we'll wait and see, and obviously we'll be going back to Salford for more news from there. But Stan Orme back, and one perhaps of the hopes the Conservatives might have had if they'd been having one of the big swings, which some of the opinion polls were suggesting they could have. This one could have been vulnerable. Now, David, this is a seat in the north. Do you think there's going to be any special regional significance?
Well, we have reason to suppose there was some suggestion in the polls that north was going harder, that it was less of a prospect for the Liberals doing well in the southeast, and the Guildford result suggests that. The north, though, is like the south in that the turnout is up 5% there, it was up 8.5% in Guildford, and we've heard from about 7 or 8 other constituencies. It's gone up from 4 to 10%. Actually in Huyton, Harold Wilson's seat, we've been told the turnout is up from 67% to 77%, so Harold Wilson seems to have stirred up his own people to vote.
Well, now, these are, of course, very early days indeed, but would you expect a large number of seats to change hands tonight? Is it possible that we might be in a real stalemate?
I think a fairly large number of seats will change hands. You will always get a certain scatter of movement, even between two parties. If their votes are just the same, you'll still get 20 or 30 seats changing hands both ways. And on the other hand, with the Liberals coming in like this, I'm quite sure we are going to get 1 or 2 real sensations of seats quite unexpectedly going Liberal, and quite likely some unexpected Liberal disappointments against this setup. On the figures so far, I suspect the Liberals will be in the bracket between 20 and 50 seats. But that's a pretty big bracket, and outside all our past experience since 1929.
Anyway, well, that's what the Liberals have to think about, and that apparently appears to be the ambition which we can offer them at the moment. Now, let's go back to Salford, where Stan Orme is speaking.
Well, congratulations, Stan Orme.
Thank you.
It did look a bit of a dicey situation for you before.
Well, we didn't think so. The campaign has really come good during the last few days, and what we are pleased about is the fact that the Labour vote, the total Labour vote, is more than equal to both the Tory and Liberal vote.
In fact, in spite of there being a Liberal and a Conservative against you, your majority has gone up to 6,000 odd, and in fact it was only 2,600 before.
That's correct, and also we had a higher percentage poll, 72%. We would have liked it even higher, but the weather was disastrous, as you know, during the last few hours. But I think there was a clear indication by the people in Salford that they want a change, and I hope that this is now reflected throughout the rest of Britain.
What do you put your increased majority down to under these circumstances? How have you done it?
Well, I believe that Labour's policies, we've got the policies over, there has been enthusiasm, and whilst I, as a candidate, have been extremely cautious at times, my workers have continually told me that it was coming good for us as the campaign developed. And I think there has been a clear understanding in the electorate what the issues are about, and particularly the type of alternative policies Labour were fighting on.
In fact, you've fought the election almost exclusively on whether people want a Labour government or a Conservative government on national issues.
Oh, completely. We fought it purely on the record of the Conservative government and on Labour's alternative.
Salford, of course, is well known for its slum problem and so forth. How far do you think local housing conditions have influenced people?
Well, only to the extent that people, as we've explained to them, we want to speed this up, and one way of doing this, of course, is to implement Labour's policies.
Sam Orme, we must speed this up because I think they're coming pretty close next door in Salford East. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's an interesting situation. We've had one result from the south and one from the north. In the south, the Liberal intervention there, or the Liberal success in Guildford, seemed to damage Labour marginally more than it damaged the Conservatives. In the north, if one just looks at the figures, perhaps superficially, it would look as if the Liberals really had damaged the Conservatives very considerably. One wonders whether this is going to show up as a trend in the course of the night. But we have, I think, the possibility of something happening at Cheltenham, and Martin Young there, are you coming up to be third?
Well, we hope so. We're on a real cliffhanger here at the moment. The mayor who's going to give the declaration is on the dais, but there's a lot of consultation down there. What seems to be happening, as far as one can judge, is that the Conservatives look confident here. The Liberal and Labour vote seems to be very much the same, so perhaps there's some dispute about that. We're not sure. But we certainly think that within a few minutes we'll be there. In fact, the returning officer is now going up to the dais with the Conservative candidate, and he's giving us a thumbs-up sign, which looks very hopeful. And he's handing the declaration over now to the Mayor, Mr. Amesbury Dodwell. The returning officer, Mr. Crabtree, surprising enough, as in Guildford, is retiring this year, so he'll be sorry not to have been first in this election. Now here, I think, any minute now, we will hear the declaration. As usual, there's these few moments where you wonder what is going to happen. Yes, here is the Mayor, and he is about to make the declaration at Cheltenham.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cheltenham Spa constituency, I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Arthur Douglas Dodds Parker,
Conservative,
21,723. Hugh Gray, 12,971.
Labour.
Frederick Carson Roger,
Liberal.
15,811.
So a big success here for the Liberals coming second.
That the undermentioned person, Arthur Douglas Dodds Parker, has been duly elected to serve as a member for
Here is the Liberals have pushed up very impressively into second place. They got 31.3% of the vote. That's 12.8% more than before. The Conservatives were down 7%. They were again, the first time the Conservatives have been below 50% of the vote there for a long while. And the Labour Party was down 5.5% to 25.7% of the vote. In other words, a slight swing, if you could compare just Conservative and Labour, a slight swing to Labour, but really a gain for the Liberals of a fairly impressive sort, plus 13%, 31.3%. Now remember, to win a seat you need over 33%, and the other sides have to be divided fairly evenly. But if they're getting that vote in Cheltenham, they're certainly going to win some seats before the night's out.
Well, that was Freddie Roger, to his friends, an eye surgeon, and he is the Liberal standard bearer there in Cheltenham, and what seems to be turning out to be Liberal benefit night. But is that right, Graham Pyatt? How do you predict it now, and how does the computer predict it?
Well, the computer's been working overtime on these results so far, Alistair, and here are the predictions after the first three results. Conservatives 303, Labour 291, Liberals 27. Conservative majority over Labour of 12. Those figures, of course, can't be completely accurate at this stage. All we can say it's neck and neck, and it seems very well possible that the Liberals will be holding the middle at the end of the day.
Well, neck and neck is one way of putting it. We haven't had a result like that in this country. Of course, we've come close to it in 1964, but you have to go back to the 1920s.
But we should remember the computer has to work only on the data it's got. We've had two safeish Southern Conservative seats where the Liberals are pushed up into second place, taking votes relatively evenly from the other two parties. One Northern Industrial seat where there has been a very big swing to the Labour Party, with admittedly Liberals coming in and getting 17% of the vote, but there is that 5% swing in Salford to set against these other two Southern results.
So the point, though, tonight, isn't it now, David, from now on, is to see which of the parties, Conservatives or Labour, can break out of this apparent stranglehold. And we'll need, obviously, a number of more seats before that happens.
I certainly think so, and I think it's very likely that neither will break out of the stranglehold. I think that's the likeliest bet. We really could have a clear Conservative majority, a clear Labour majority, or a no clear majority, and that, I think, is where I should probably put one's money at this moment.
All right, Conservatives have held another safe seat in the south there, Torbay. It would have been very remarkable if they had not. It was called Torquay for so many years. It is now called Torbay. We'll be having fuller details on that in just a moment. Let's go back again to Salford for that other result in Salford East. How are we getting on there?
Well, in fact, it's expected in a couple of minutes' time. The Mayor of Salford has done his sprint, his little sprint between the two counting rooms, and after that Labour success in Salford West, we now wait to see whether they've repeated it in Salford East, where, of course, Frank Alone is the sitting member with a majority of some 6,270 in 1970. That was a three-cornered fight. It's a three-cornered fight again today. His opponents are a woman barrister, Mrs. Betty Knightley, for the Conservatives, and for the Liberals, Howard Watkin, who's a 23-year-old bank clerk. Both of them are standing for Parliament for the first time. Here's no stranger to us, the Mayor of Salford, Councillor Williams.
Ladies and gentlemen, I, Harry Williams, being the returning officer for the Salford East constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Frank Julian Alone,
Labour,
14,426. Betty Knightley,
Conservative,
7,495. Howard Watkin,
Liberal,
4,536. And that the under-mentioned person, Frank Julian Alone, has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
A 2.1% swing, much less than the 5.7% in the other seat there. The Liberals coming in and increasing their vote by 6.7% to 17% of the vote. Labour down 1.1, the Conservatives down 5.3. Now two northern seats with clear swings to Labour, and it'll affect our predictions, but still, I think, keep us in the no clear majority area.
I want to pay tribute to my workers who have done a magnificent job in freezing February nights. I also want to pay tribute to my two opponents who played absolutely fair. It is far too early to predict the result nationally, but it's quite clear what the Salford people want on this occasion. The people will decide tonight. By tomorrow midday, we'll know the result nationally. The people will decide. That's democracy. Thank you very much.
Frank Lorne, of course, who's a member of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. He has been there since 1967. Left-wing views, he's been the MP there since 1955. Let's go now to Newcastle Central and hear how Ted Short is getting on.
And here is the Sheriff, Alderman Cyril Lipton, with the declaration.
I, Cyril Lipton, being the returning officer for Newcastle upon Tyne, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election for Newcastle upon Tyne Central was as follows. John Michael Jack,
Conservative,
4,180. Edward Watson Short,
Labour,
12,182. And that Mr. Edward Short has been duly elected to serve as a member of the said constituency.
A minute swing to Labour. I think it's a minute swing to the Conservatives. But anyway, it's virtually a replay of last time.
Well, it's not quite, is it, David, because the Liberals were in last time. They didn't fight it this time.
And many were very cold indeed.
Yeah.
It's been a bitterly cold day in Newcastle. Well, I thank you all for the courtesy and kindness you've shown throughout the day. I'd also like to thank the police for their courtesy and the friendly way in which they've carried out their duties. Especially, I've seen them helping many old people. But perhaps above all, I'd like to thank my own supporters in the constituency. This is my 23rd year as a Member of Parliament, and my percentage majority, and that's the thing that counts, has never fluctuated very much. This time it's gone up by 3.76%. My son has just worked it out on his pocket computer. So that's a very good result. I would like to thank all the people in central Newcastle who've supported me loyally throughout all these years. I'd also like to thank...
So there's Mr. Edward Short, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, a former Chief Whip and, of course, a former Secretary for Education. He's been the member there in Newcastle Central since 1951. And now a word on these trends from Robert Mackenzie.
Well, if I were the Prime Minister, I'd be very worried now on these first results. First of all, it does seem to be unlikely that the Conservatives are going to get a working majority. They need 318 to do that, and it looks like 303 on the first computer prediction, now down to 301. On the other hand, the Labour Party has made really quite impressive swings in 2 or 3 constituencies, and the Liberals are almost doubling their share of the vote in the constituencies we've seen so far. So I think it is now highly unlikely, in my view, the Conservatives will get the 318 they need to form a government on their own.
And David, how do you read that?
Well, we've heard from 3 safe-ish Labour seats and 3 safe-ish Conservative seats. We'll see the Torbay figures in a moment. And in all the safe Conservative seats, the Liberals have made a massive advance and have got into second place. In the north, it's been a straight Labour-Liberal fight. Here's the Torbay result, which does show a Liberal increase jumping to second place with 12.1% more of the vote than last time. The Conservatives down 7.1, Labour down 5.0. Once again, the Liberals have taken more votes, it seems, from the Conservatives than from Labour.
And Sir Frederick Bennett back. Well, he'd be surprised if he wasn't back. He was Parliamentary Private Secretary to Mr. Maudling for a number of years, and he's been, of course, an MP since 1951. So that's the situation from both north and south. Still waiting to hear from some of the other front-runners in the race. While we have a moment, let's go back to Robin Day.
I wonder, Eric Lubbock would very much like to see the Torbay result again, because he didn't quite get it, and he's got his computer. I wonder, any chance of seeing that, while I ask Lord Windlesham to say what he thinks of Robert Mackenzie's view that Mr. Heath is unlikely to get a clear majority tonight.
Well, we've only had 6 seats, and what matters is who wins seats, not who comes second. I think it's very early to start to make general predictions at this stage.
Eric Lubbock, while we may get the Torbay result again, it was Liberal got 20,755 votes.
Well, I think, yes, it's too early.
There it is. Here's the Torbay result coming up now. There you are. Now, what do you make of that, Eric?
Yeah, no. Well, I think that's an outstanding result. I think this is absolutely splendid. It confirms what we've seen in the other seats that the Liberals have been fighting. we're getting far better results than we got in '64, which was the peak Liberal year since I can remember. And we're getting the sort of figures that go back to the 1920s, and particularly to the 1929 election when we had 59 seats. I think that the estimates that were made in advance are going to prove pessimistic. You remember I've been talking about over 40 seats, and I think that's certainly the likelihood on the figures we've been looking at.
Well, Lord Davis, for the Labour Party, how do you see it?
Well, I think the pattern, I think it's too soon to make definite pattern, but the pattern is this. Whatever the computers and the psephologists may say, the southeast of England, the gin and martini belt and the commuters, they will gain seats, the Liberals will gain seats from the Conservatives. In the areas that do things with their hands and manufacture, you've had two craftsmen there, two political craftsmen, Stan Orme and Frank Alone. Excellent ministerial timber is Stan Orme, a worker. And whatever Liberals stand there, the mythology of liberalism will not stand up against the practical politics that is put forward in these areas that produce your coal, your steel and your cotton.
What do you think of the idea of the possibility that if Labour continues to do better than the polls originally suggested, that there might be a minority Labour government with the problem of sharing with the Liberals?
Now this is quite a point that anybody with any political nous would have to agree with you. This possibility stands. And that means there's a terrific responsibility, Eric, on the Liberal Party in this transition period. And it will need, I don't mean this in a derogatory sense,
But isn't there a responsibility also, if there's a Labour Prime Minister, to see if he can win the cooperation of the Liberals?
Yes, exactly. The reality of the British position transcends the idiosyncrasies of the politicians at this moment.
So you think you're really hinting, Lord Davis, aren't you, that Labour might have to come to terms with a strong Liberal membership in the House of Commons if it got to a Labour minority government?
Well, now look, I don't...
You're only in the Lords, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm in the Lords, it's up there, but I do know the courage of our people in the Commons. We've done it. We would govern with a majority of 3 for 18 months at least.
Thank you. Well, we'll come back to you later, gentlemen. Alistair?
3 members of their Lordship's House. And now let's have a look at those who are really out in the cold in Trafalgar Square and see how they're taking it now. And Desmond Wilcox.
And more than out in the cold, out in the rain now, Alistair. But for the first time in the programme, at least those who cast votes to bring about the results that are being discussed and pontificated upon in the studio. Let's have a word with some of the 1,000 people or so who've praised the elements. Can I have a word with you, sir?
Yes.
What have you voted today?
Liberal.
Is that your normal voting pattern?
No, but I feel we want a wind of change. Not too cold from Siberia, which we're getting now, nor too hot from Greece. And liberalism provides us with that choice.
Did you vote Liberal with any expectation of seeing a Liberal government, or because of dissatisfaction with either the existing government or the prospect of another Labour government?
Because I wanted a wind of liberalism in our body politic.
What do you do for a living, can I ask?
I'm an exporter.
And how have you been affected by recent gloom, doom and crisis?
I belong to a very good firm, and they've got their own generator, so we're on a 5-day week.
Let me move on to someone else. Did you vote today, can I ask you?
Yes, I did.
What did you vote?
Labour.
Why? It would be fair to say that a Conservative vote would probably get a round of applause as well.
No, I think it's about time. I think it's about time that somebody got rid of pompous Mr. Heat.
Would you be correctly described as a first voter, an immigrant voter?
Well, no, I wouldn't say I'm an immigrant voter. I've been in England since 1959.
But is this the first time you've voted?
Yes, it is the first time.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I'm from a cold and damp Trafalgar Square back to a nice warm Alistair Burnett in the television centre. Desmond Wilcox.
Oh, well, we'll send the relief party, Desmond, if it gets any worse. But it seemed a fairly warm crowd. Well, now, Graham, we have had a few results in now. You say the computer had a struggle early on. How's he feeling?
Well, the computer's received and processed 7 results now, and the predictions have changed very little in the last few results. Conservative 301, Labour 296, Liberal 24. So it's still neck and neck. But in addition, the computer is telling me how much confidence to have in these results. What we're getting from the computer is that the Conservatives will get at least 270 seats, but we don't know how many more. Similarly for Labour, at least 270 seats, but we don't know how many more. And for Liberals and other parties, at least 20. Now, when I add these together, you can see that we are not yet sure who is going to get the critical number of 318 seats. It could be the Conservative Party moving across, or equally, we could have the Labour Party moving across. We just don't know, and of course the third possibility is the Liberals and other parties expanding in the middle. So the black gap in the middle of the slidometer now is the uncertainty that we're waiting for further results to resolve.
And of course we haven't heard, and aren't likely to hear for a little while yet, from Scotland or Wales, where these other parties are at their strongest.
Indeed, yes, that's quite right.
So there's everything to play for by everybody, and a fairly long night apparently in progress. So I think this is a chance for Robin Day to talk now to one of the men who may have hopes of coming back into office if Labour can indeed reach that magic figure, Mr. Reg Prentice.
Yes.
And with me is Reg Prentice, a Labour frontbencher, shadow spokesman on employment in the last Parliament, and a certain member of a Labour cabinet, minority or majority if there is one. How do you read it so far, Reg?
I think that we're in with a chance now of a working majority. I say that because I think that the results so far perhaps underestimate the potential Labour vote. I think in seats such as Guildford, Torbay, Cheltenham, a number of Labour people may have voted Liberal because they thought the Liberal had the better chance of beating the Conservative. I think when we get more results, we may get a better result for Labour and a working Labour majority.
Now, I've got down also, to join in this discussion, Reg, Ron Hayward at Transport House. Can you hear me, Ron?
That's the maximum. Hello?
Can you hear me, Ron?
I can just hear you now. Yes, Robin, I can hear you.
I'm just having a chat with Reg Prentice, but I'd like to bring you in. How do you see things down there at Transport House?
Well, we're quite happy. We have a quiet confidence we're doing okay. And we note that in all places where there is a Liberal challenge, a strong Liberal challenge, their vote is holding up very well.
Can I put a point to you? Obviously, you're pleased that you're doing much better than the opinion polls said you might this morning. But with all the things you've been able to say about this government during the campaign and the balance of payments and all the rest of it and the cost of living, isn't it extraordinary that more people have not voted Labour and so many people have obviously gone over to the Liberals?
Well, we shall have to wait and see for a few more results before we make these comments, Robin, you know. But the polls, if they do anything, the way the newspapers present them, do give a bandwagon effect, you know. This is bound to be to the advantage of the Liberals. I don't complain about it, but it is a fact.
It doesn't seem to have been to advantage of the Tories.
No, I agree with you, and I'm not complaining about that either.
What do you think of the possibility? Let me put a question to Reg Prentice now. What do you think of the possibility of how do you view the prospect of a minority Labour government having to rely on Liberal support?
Well, naturally, I hope we're going to have a working majority, and I think this is still a strong possibility. If we haven't got a working majority, we'll have to consider the position. If we're the biggest party, I'm sure we'll be able to form a government, and I hope we'll be able to carry on. There'll be a challenge then to the Liberals as to whether they will give us the support I think we deserve for the policies we should be carrying out.
But if you are a minority government, isn't there a challenge to you to invite the Liberals in?
Well, we shall obviously be a much bigger party than the Liberals. What you're postulating is that we should be the biggest party, therefore we shall form the government, we shall call the tune, and we should be doing the things that the country needs. Now it will be up to the Liberals then to decide whether they support us. I hope they will.
An unstable situation?
Well, I think any minority is a government is an unstable situation, but nevertheless we may have to make the best of it and carry on.
Thank you, Reg. Thank you, Ron Hayward. We'll hear more from you during the evening or morning.
Thank you.
Well, that have good news for Labour, of course, in that they have held Accrington. That's one of the seats that would have gone Conservative had there been any appreciable swing to the Conservatives in this election. In fact, there's a substantial swing to Labour in that seat. Let's have a look at that result. A swing of over 5% to Labour there in the northwest.
That was the first seat they might have hoped, the Conservatives might have hoped to win that we've heard from tonight. Well, there's been a very big swing. The second biggest swing to Labour we've had tonight, only exceeded in one of the Salford seats.
And Arthur Davidson, who took the seat there, he's been a Labour MP at least since 1966, re-established. So let's go back now, go to Wolverhampton now, where we have some news and hope of a declaration.
Looking forward to the result for Wolverhampton North East. Mrs. Rennie Short's seat.
Mr. Hawksley, 16,000 Mr. Jordan,
the Mayor of Wolverhampton, Dennis Birch, is expected to make the declaration quite shortly. Just before you joined us, Mrs. Short, a very popular figure in this part of the world, was giving lots of thumbs-up signs to her colleagues all around the hall. And we take that to mean that she's extremely happy. She's held this seat for 10 years, and there was some thought that a majority of 1,800 or so might be in danger.
Just taking a little drink there. Perhaps a number of Labour people are doing the same, having had the thumbs up from Mrs. Rennie Short. However, that's, we wait to hear too what's happening from Wolverhampton southwest, Mr. Enoch Powell's old seat. There's a recount at Keighley, so that really does mean that it's neck and neck in some of these marginals now. We'll keep you up to date about what's happening.
In Keighley. The old Labour member is standing as an independent there.
That's one of the Tavern members coming in there. So let's, we may have some news now from Wolverhampton. Let's see if Philip Tibbenham has anything for us.
The Mayor still seems to be about ready to get this result. I was saying earlier that Mrs. Short's majority of 1,800, some people said, was looking a little shaky with the reorganisation of the boundaries, which brought in some strong Tory areas, but we'll wait and see. I think Mr. Birch is coming up now.
His Worship the Mayor, Mr. Dennis Birch, as returning officer for the Wolverhampton North East constituency, is about to declare the result of this election. He will give the candidate's name in alphabetical order and the number of votes which they have polled, and will then declare the name of the candidate who has been elected. His Worship the Mayor.
Ladies and gentlemen, as returning officer for the constituency of Wolverhampton North East, I declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Philip Warren Hawksley,
Conservative,
16,318. John Colin Campbell Jordan,
British Movement,
711. Rennie Short,
Labour,
28,000. Rennie Short, 28,935. Anthony David Kenivet Webber,
National Front,
2,548. And I declare that Mrs. Rennie Short is elected as Member of Parliament for this constituency.
Mr. Returning Officer, it is my pleasure to make this my fourth vote of thanks to you for conducting the election in Wolverhampton North East.
That is much the biggest swing we've had tonight, a 10.6% swing to Labour. There were stories of big movements in the Midlands. This sort of swing, coupled with the others, could perfectly well put the Labour Party in. But we've obviously got a much wider spread of swing tonight than we've had in any previous election, so we still should wait. There are stories of a similar swing in the other Wolverhampton seat, so let's wait and see.
And of course these are results that Mr. Enoch Powell in particular, who told his supporters, and he has many of them in Wolverhampton in the Midlands, to vote Labour, and we'll wait and see just whether that has had any effect or not. Let's have a look at the results that we have there. Wolverhampton South East. This is the other seat in Wolverhampton, another new one. We say it's been held by Labour. That is presumed to have been held by Labour compared with what it would have done in 1970 had it existed. It was really the Bilston seat in those days. Bob Edwards is back. That asterisk means he's a former sitting member. And now let's have a look at another result. Here's Alan Fitch back in Wigan again with a swing to Labour.
3%, enough to put Labour in if it was general.
And another result? No, we are waiting for some more, but it does look as if there are very big swings tonight in different parts of the country. Bob, how do you size it up?
Well, I would strengthen the remark I made earlier. I think Mr. Heath is almost certainly losing his majority now, without question, and in fact I now think it's more likely that Labour will be the largest party and quite possibly a majority party. But Labour, I think on present form, will certainly have more seats in the House of Commons than Mr. Heath, which raises the whole question of the government's possible resignation and the rest.
And now, what sort of effect do you think Enoch Powell has had on these results in the Midlands, precisely near his own stronghold?
Well, the very big swings might, in some way, relate to the fact that he said, get out and vote Labour, and I've always thought he could command 2 or 3% of the vote of the country.
Well, now, you remember there was a local opinion poll in Birmingham Perry Bar, which showed a swing, in fact, of 15%. From Conservative to Labour after Mr. Powell's first intervention in this campaign. That's plainly evidence he's going to use inside the Conservative Party.
Oh, indeed. And he may have the same size of vote, indeed, that George Wallace has in America.
Depends if he stays inside the Conservative Party.
He said he would die a Conservative, I think, David. Anyway, let's go now to Devon North, where the other man who, of course, come on so very strongly in this campaign, Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, has his seat. Let's go over there and hear the news.
So it's all eyes on Mr. Jeremy Thorpe. Back to camera at the moment. He's been walking around. All eyes, well, there have been at least 4 television cameras, film units, following around the counting hall here. With all the indications of a swing to the Liberals everywhere else, the personal proof of it could be here in North Devon, because it's here, of course, Mr. Thorpe, the man who was talking a few days ago, almost in terms of being in a position to form his own cabinet, or at least of holding the balance of power, is defending a majority of only 369. So it's a personal as well as a national hanger for him here. Since the last election, the boundaries have been changed so that 1 in 4 of the voters in this constituency are new voters. The 20,000 new voters have been added from the Old Torrington constituency. Anyway, we're expecting the result at about 1:30. This is David Lomax, Devon North.
So there we are, Mr. Thorpe still with his own stronghold to be looked at, except it was made extremely marginal, as we all know, as a result of some boundary changes by the boundary commissioners. And there we have a recount at Nelson and Colne. That's one of the seats the Tories also took last time. So it's obviously very narrow in these seats. Now to Wolverhampton Southwest for some news of the declaration.
For the Southwest constituency is about to declare the result of this election. He will give the candidate's name in alphabetical order and the number of votes which have been polled, and will then declare the name of the candidate who has been elected. His Worship the Mayor.
Ladies and gentlemen, as returning officer for the constituency of Wolverhampton South West, I declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Nicholas William Budgeon,
Conservative,
23,123. Garth Anthony Cooper,
National Front,
1,523. Helen Valerie Middleweek,
Labour,
16,222. Joseph Wernick,
Liberal,
9,691.
no change.
And I declare that Nicholas William Budgeon is I declare that Nicholas William Budgeon is elected as Member of Parliament for this constituency.
Does it work?
Yes, it has.
Recorded recent elections, really an extraordinary result. I suppose one must say that it was Mr. Powell's personal vote, and we do have evidence now of his personal influence in the West Midlands. All 3 Wolverhampton seats have swung more than any other seat, a lot more, 7%, 10%, and now in Mr. Powell's own seat, 17% almost swing to Labour. The Liberals 19.2%, doing very respectably, but and it may be their vote that cut into the Conservatives. But
to the principles of the Tory party.
Well, that was Nicholas Budgeon, who's a barrister. He fought Small Heath in Birmingham in 1970. He is the inheritor of Mr. Powell's seat there. You would also see there Helene Middleweek, who is the Labour candidate, who's done so well there. And at least 16,221 other people took Mr. Powell's advice to vote Labour in his old seat, besides Mr. Powell himself. Well, now, Graham, we have these very big swings to Labour in the Midlands. These must be having an impact and probably will spread perhaps elsewhere in the Midlands if the Birmingham polls turn out to be right. What is the computer saying?
Well, with 11 results in, here it is. Conservatives 274, Labour now ahead with 325 on the predictions, Liberal 22, a predicted Labour majority over the Conservatives of 51. In addition to the switch from a Conservative predicted victory to a Labour predicted victory, we're also getting close to the point now where it seems unlikely that the Conservatives could have an overall majority. We are eliminating the possibility of the blue Conservatives coming up over the 318 mark. We're not quite there yet, but the minimum number of seats for the Liberals, the Labour Party and other fourth party candidates is getting very close to the 318 mark.
So the Conservatives will find it, you say, almost impossible to organise the House of Commons. Now, how confident are you about the Labour figure?
The prediction, of course, of 325 is our best guess on the basis of the present information. We're not completely confident, of course, about that. What we're saying is that we think now they will get at least 280, 285 seats. We expect, of course, more, but can't be clear how many more.
in these early figures, though, a few seats can have a great influence. If Wolverhampton was right outside the line, as it seems to have been, it could have a fairly big effect on the prediction, couldn't it, Graham?
Yes, indeed it could. And one of the things we're finding is that the swing, as defined between seats where Liberals are intervening, is different from the ones where we're having straight fight.
Well, let's go over now to Lincoln. Mike Cockrell reporting from the count there.
13,487. For Peter Mile Moran,
Conservative.
13,299. For Dick Taverne, 14,780.
Dick Taverne has held Lincoln.
And I therefore declare that Dick Taverne is duly elected to serve as a Member of Parliament for the constituency of Lincoln.
He had a 13,000 majority in the last election. It's right the way down in this election.
Can we clear here?
Well, that was a 1,300 majority for Dick Taverne, nothing like he had in the by-election. He scraped home with only about 35% of the poll in a very close race. It was, yes, 35.6% of the poll. It was a three-way race in which Labour just topped the Conservatives, and there was a very high turnout there for 78% compared to 71% at the by-election and 73% at the general election.
And that goes down, of course, as a Democratic Labour gain. At least, certainly, he won it at the by-election. He's held it at the general election. This is really rather unusual, David, in fact, in modern times, for an independent to hold on at a general election.
Yes, we've only had S.O. Davis at the last election since the war. We have the case of Eddie Milne in Blythe that they're waiting for tonight, trying to do the same thing.
See how he comes along. Well, there's Mr. Taverne, and of course that won't perhaps be very good news for some of his former colleagues in the Labour Party. It also, I suppose, raises questions for Mr. Taverne himself, having left the Labour Party, how he is going to behave if in fact there is, as the computer is now predicting, a Labour majority in the next House of Commons. Clearly, I don't suppose he can expect office in it. He can, of course, I imagine, hope to have some influence with some of his friends there. That's quite a poser for him. I thought his face was rather thoughtful as he heard that result, and not only because it was such a narrow one for him. So, David, now I don't think from that result that any of the other Taverne candidates are going to do very much.
No, we are having a recount in Keighley, and it may be that the Taverne candidate made a difference to which side won. If you have a recount, a third-party candidate can make a difference. Well, and the same may happen in South East Bristol.
Well, that's Mr. Wedgwood Benn's seat, of course.
Well, the swing to Labour, he should be able to hold on reasonably comfortably.
All right, well, let's go now to Alan Watson at Tory party headquarters.
Well, here at Conservative Central Office in Smith Square, London, the mood of the Conservatives is distinctly tight-lipped. At about 10 past 10, after the polls had closed, people said that they were quietly confident. But since then, the mood has subtly changed. I say subtly because very little is actually visible. But Lord Carrington arrived in this building just over an hour ago. He told me as he went up the stairs to private rooms that he wouldn't be making any sort of comment at all until the results were, I quote him, quite clear. Since then, that's been confirmed to me on the telephone inside this building. And until then, they are distinctly tight-lipped. But the mood is extremely sombre, and clearly the impact of the Liberals so far has been very important. That's all from Conservative Central Office, and back now to the studio.
Well, I think it's a reasonable rule at elections. If the Conservatives aren't saying much, they're rather down in the dumps. And we perhaps may wait a little while before we hear anything from Mr. Heath. Of course, he is attending his own count, but whether he'll be able to say very much at that stage of the night. But certainly the computer at the moment is showing the good news for Labour and not for the Conservatives. Here's a little bit of news for Conservatives in Tunbridge Wells. This is a new seat, and we would presume that the Conservatives had held it in 1970. That's why held now is in inverted commas.
The Liberals are pushed up into second place again. In every one of the 5 Conservative seats we've heard from tonight, the Liberals have pushed Labour into second place. So if we tell you the Labour vote has fallen, the main contribution to the fall in the Labour vote has been in these safe Conservative seats where they had no particular hope of victory.
Well, that's Mr. Patrick Mayhew. He's not a relative of Mr. Chris Mayhew, the Labour MP, but he's back in Tunbridge Wells. Well, with these upsets and the favourite this morning now running very disappointingly for its backers, I wonder what's happening at Ladbrokes. Julian Wilson.
Well, the answer is that there is a new favourite to win the general election. In fact, there hasn't been a bet for the Tories in the last half hour. All of these are Labour bets. Labour are now 7-4 on to win the election, with the Tories 5-4 against. Over the other side of London, Labour are 5-2 on with William Hills, with the Tories 2-1 against. But still, the most popular bet at present is that there'll be no overall majority. That's a 6-4 on shot. It's been perhaps the best bet shot, but even as I speak, there's still more money flooding onto Labour at 7-4 on. In fact, I've just heard 700-4 bet on at this very moment.
Well, there often are bets on photo finishes, but of course, at the moment it does seem fairly clear that the first favourite has blown up. We have news of the turnout at Mr. Heath's seat at Sidcup. It is up 15% from last time. It's now at 84.8%, 85%. And that, presumably, since the Liberals were saying they had a most effective canvass in Sidcup and most encouraged by it, looks as if a number of Liberals are showing their teeth there. Well, now, Robert Mackenzie, are you still saying we're in balance, or do you accept that Labour could be pushing ahead?
Well, I now think it's distinctly likely that Labour will have the 318 that are required. I think we've got to be very careful because so many of them in the constellation of Mr. Powell's own bailiwick have been coming in that could be distorting it. I would put it the other way around. I think it's highly unlikely the Conservatives can form a government on their own. And a divided House, or else Labour in a clear majority, that's the main choice now, I think.
Now, on this Powell point, would you expect his influence to extend really elsewhere than in the Midlands?
Yes, I would. Not anything like the same scale, but I think his influence is a national influence, and I'd be very surprised if it didn't account for some part, small part, of Labour's good showing in many other parts of the country. Let me add one word. We're going to be talking about the possibility of minority government if it moves into dead heat. We shouldn't really be too frightened by that. After all, 3 or 4 major countries in the world have minority governments and are quite used to them, not to mention Canada.
To name only one. Yes. Anyway, that's the situation. I think we have another result to take now. This is Manchester Central. And there's Harold Lever, Labour, of course the former minister, back again, perhaps expecting to be a minister again.
And the third candidate is Michael Steed, who we've often seen on these programmes, standing as a rather inactive Liberal candidate and getting 17% of the vote.
But that again is a clear swing to Labour, isn't it, David, and confirms what's been happening in Salford and elsewhere.
No, the whole of the northern part of the country has been moving. In fact, so far tonight, Labour is down 3.2 and the Conservatives are down 9.4 in their share of the vote. The Liberals are up 10.3 in their share of the vote. What does seem to be plain is that whoever wins this election is going to have a lower share of the vote than any victorious government. It's unlikely they'll have the support of more than 2/5 of the population.
So then we'll have a lot of talk about mandates, and perhaps the word referendum will crop up again in this sort of situation.
Well, whoever's in power will in fact say that no government has had 50% of the vote since the war.
There's a seat changing hands now with Labour taking Keighley. And that, of course, is a serious reverse for the Conservatives there in Yorkshire.
So that's the first seat.
First seat going. So that we'll have more news about Keighley and the details. Remember, there's a recount there. That's the first Conservative seat to go to Labour tonight. But I understand at the moment, Robin Day is talking to Rennie Short in Wolverhampton.
Mrs. Short, just before I talk to you, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Just before I talk to you, I'd like to get Lord Windlesham's comment on the prediction that there will almost certainly not be a Conservative government, and there's probably likely to be a majority Labour government, as seen at the moment through Robert Mackenzie's qualified eyes and the computers.
That sounds marvellous.
Hold on, Mrs. Short. I
Yes.
want to see what Lord Windlesham says, who's smiling for the first time this evening.
Well, you told me I looked gloomy earlier on, and now the results aren't too good. Perhaps I should put a better face on it. Elections are very unpredictable things. We've seen 16 seats in. The first seat has changed hands just now. There are many hours to go. I don't think that we should be unduly depressed, but the indications at the moment are not what would encourage anybody.
Mrs. Short, how do you see the situation both in Wolverhampton and outside?
Well, the situation from my part of Wolverhampton, of course, looks absolutely marvellous.
You've got a 16.7 swing in your favour.
Something like that, yes, with a supermajority of, well, getting on for 13,000.
Now, how much was that due to your charm and brilliance and political ability, and how much due to Mr. Powell telling people to vote for you?
Well, I don't think Mr. Powell told anyone to vote for me, but we've worked very hard here, of course, for this result. And, of course, we had a redistributed constituency with 30,000 new electors, which was a completely unknown part of the world to us until the boundary review took place. So we've worked very hard in the new area, and I think that this has paid off.
Yes.
Certainly is a marvellous result, and we're very excited. And it must surely mean that we have a Labour government if this is continued throughout the country. It must mean that a large number of Tory marginal seats must fall.
But seriously, Mrs. Short, Mr. Powell...
Seriously, Mr. Day.
Yes?
Seriously, that was seriously.
Yes, I know. I wasn't challenging that, Mrs. Short. What I meant was to say this. Seriously, there must have been some significance in the Wolverhampton area of what Mr. Powell did and said.
Well, Mr. Day, you may find it a little difficult to believe, but we found that Mr. Powell had sunk almost without trace in Wolverhampton. He was hardly ever mentioned to me during my campaign. I don't know what it was like on the other side, of course, in his old constituency, but his name wasn't mentioned with me.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and you look very happy, if I may say so.
Yes, I feel it. Marvellous result.
Thank you. Alistair?
And so, Labour eyes are smiling in Wolverhampton and elsewhere at the moment. Let's see what they're doing down in Trafalgar Square there with Desmond Wilcox.
Well, despite the rain, they're shouting and cheering. There are about 2,000 or 3,000 of them here at the moment. So far, nobody's had the courage to plunge into one of the fountains, but one thing's for certain, there will be somebody doing that before the night's out, because they always do down here. But we have some ladies, Conservative ladies, I think it's fair to say, wearing pins. What do you think of the results you've heard so far and the predictions that you're going to see a Labour government in?
Well, I'm still reasonably optimistic, but obviously the results so far haven't been quite what I would have hoped. I think it's interesting that nobody here will let me speak.
I don't think they're trying to stop you speak. I just think they're all trying to be heard. If I can ask you, is this the first time you've voted? Can I ask you to come forward a bit?
Yes, it is the first time I have voted.
And do you feel confident that the party you've obviously voted for is going to get in or not?
I still feel confident. There's nothing to be disheartened about as yet.
So you're against Bob Mackenzie, if not Mr. Wilson as well, then?
Yeah.
Let me ask this young chap up here, if I can. You've got a vote Labour badge on.
Yes, that's right.
Is it your first time of voting?
Yes, it is, yes.
Can I ask how old you are?
I'm 21. I just missed the last one.
So you're one of the first voters?
That's right, yes.
Why have you voted Labour?
Well, mainly because I'm a student. I'm disgusted with the government record on student grants, also old age pensions. I do economics. They've made a balls up of the economic situation.
Well, let me ask you, if I can, do your parents vote Labour, or have you made your own mind up about the way you've gone in this election as a first voter?
My father voted Labour in the 66 and 70 election. He's voting Tory this time. My mother's voting Liberal. I made up my own mind.
What will your father say about the way you're voting against the family pattern, regardless of the national pattern?
Oh, he won't mind. He leaves me to make up my own mind.
Thank you very much. And from Trafalgar Square, Desmond Wilcox, back to the television centre.
Stay clear of those fountains, Desmond, tonight. You may have seen that little headline there, the Conservatives have won Romford. That is not a surprise. Romford has changed so much, as we said at the very beginning of the programme, that they were pretty certain to take it as a safe Conservative seat. Let's have a look at some of the results which have been coming in. Here's Solihull, Percy Grieve, Conservative QC and Chairman of the Franco-British Parliamentary Relations Committee, back.
The Liberals second, again, as in every single Conservative seat we've heard from, Liberals second.
And Rossendale, this is one the Conservatives took last time and have held tonight, very narrowly, with a small swing to Labour.
But the Liberal Party, look, doing very well. They're 25%.
And Keighley, this is Miss Joan Hall losing her seat there to Mr. Bob Cryer, who is a technical college teacher.
And the Social Democrat was not responsible for that significant Labour victory. And the Liberals got 17%.
And there we are. In fact, the Social Democrat lost his deposit there. So that is the situation. Not very much comfort for the Conservatives so far tonight. We see there Labour holding Holborn and St Pancras. Well, surprising in the way the results have been going if they had not done so. Only one seat which has changed hands so far tonight in Keighley, and the Conservatives, I suppose, David, just a little bit relieved that they held Rossendale.
I think they must be very relieved to hold Rossendale. I mean, it's the best news they've had so far, because Rossendale was a Labour seat solidly from 1945 to 1970, and if they could hold on to other seats like that, they would be doing very well indeed, and it would, I mean, it throws it into doubt that what is now looking rather like a Labour victory, I mean, we're swithering around, but the swings are suggesting that.
I think you're just trying to keep up the suspense, and I include the computer in this as well.
The voters are keeping the suspense up, not me.
All right, let's see, end the suspense in Romford now. This is a new seat, changed remarkably. The Conservatives would have taken it in 1970. Indeed, the Labour MP who had it in 1970 didn't stand this time.
That's the most significant thing. It's the first thing from the outer London area, most significant, and it's down 20%. The Conservatives share the vote, and the Labour Party, the Liberals, got 28% of the vote there.
And Lena Jager back in Holborn and St Pancras South. Very small swing there. So, Dick Deverne, who got back also very narrowly indeed tonight at Lincoln, and one wonders whether it can be called a stronghold. Anyway, let's go over there where he is talking.
Mr. Deverne, we're seeing strong evidence of a swing to Labour. You must be a very disappointed man tonight.
Well, not because of the swing to Labour. I'm disappointed that the first of the other candidates hasn't done very well. I'm delighted that I'm re-elected in Lincoln. I'm somewhat disappointed at the size of my majority.
But you have run virtually a one-man campaign against what you consider the extremism in the Labour Party, and here the electorate of Britain seems to be voting against you and for the Labour Party.
All right, well, then that's a verdict of the electorate.
But don't you feel a little disappointed yourself, having been on the verge of a Labour cabinet, if a Labour government is returned, that you won't get office, you'll be a one-man band?
No, I don't regret any of the stands I've taken. It seems to me that this is going to be a very difficult result in a very difficult circumstances. What I have urged very strongly during the election was that the circumstances were so serious that the only way it could be solved would be through a grand coalition. And it may well be that either we have to have another early election or we have to have such a grand coalition. As far as my own position was concerned, I never took a preference to either the Conservatives or the Labour Party winning.
If there were such a grand coalition, would you hope that they might invite you to serve in it?
No. No.
Do you think Lincoln can now be called a stronghold of Tavernism now?
Well, less strong than it was. I mean, what's happened is that all the attention of the press and the television was centered entirely on the three parties. There was no opportunity to get a national viewpoint across, and as a result, I was in the same position as the other candidates, fighting as an independent. And of course, if you fight as an independent, you have, as one-man independent, you have a considerable uphill struggle against the major parties. And here we have a result where, nevertheless, I have triumphed. So it's a mixed result, but mainly good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taverne.
And that's Dick Taverne back in Lincoln. I should say, of course, though his seat hasn't changed hands since his celebrated by-election, it is a change since 1970, so 2 seats have changed hands. Keighley has gone to Labour. Dick Taverne has held his seat he took, retained himself at the by-election as independent. We have a recount at Stockport North, which suggests that the Conservative is in trouble there. And let's look at some other results which have come through. Here's Wickham and Sir John Hall back in a Conservative stronghold, but with a small swing to Labour.
Liberals third there. It's only the second Conservative seat in which the Liberals have failed to get to second place, but they've still got 24% of the vote.
And Paul Rose, who's a Labour man, very interested indeed in Northern Ireland, returned.
Liberals, 19% of the vote.
And Dan Jones, a long-time member there for Burnley, hasn't done terribly well.
A low swing to the Labour Party, 1% swing to Labour. No, swing to the Conservatives. I'm so sorry, 1% swing to the Conservatives.
And that's the situation so far. And we do have some patchy results there to be looked at. And although no doubt people's spirits are very high at Transport House, there are 1 or 2 factors to be taken into account. Let's hear from Keith Graves how things are going.
Well, quiet confidence is the official description of the mood here at Transport House at the moment, but elation would be a better description. It's in marked contrast to the feelings here during the past 3 weeks. There's been something of an air of gloom about, and that gloom deepened earlier this evening when it was discovered that the weather in the north and the Midlands had been bad round about 8 o'clock. Labour voters are notorious late people to turn out. Then when it was discovered that there had been a high poll, confidence started rising. As now, as I say, it is elation. Mr. Wilson came here this morning with a message of elation and confidence. He must be feeling confidence now in Huyton, and that confidence is marked down here at Transport House at the moment. This is Keith Graves at Transport House.
And you would see there the interesting news for the Conservatives that they have held Nelson and Cone after the recount. Now that is quite an interesting seat. They've held on to Rossendale and Nelson.
Yes, but Nelson and Cone, we shall look for the figures because it was one where the Liberals had greatest hopes in the light of local government breakthroughs. But still there are now 2 marginals that the Conservatives have held on to, which they would have been losing if there's been a great Labour sweep. The Liberal, our projections are now coming down. The Labour Party is just trembling about the clear majority level, and we, of course, haven't heard a thing from Scotland or Wales.
We may yet see the dawn rise on this trembling situation. Anyhow, it looks rather sticky at the moment. I don't think either side can really break out the champagne. Do you think so, though, Graham?
No, indeed not. We've got 25 results in now. The board I'm looking at ticks up the results faster than I can follow it as soon as they come in. And the Conservatives are predicted to have 290 seats, Labour 319, Liberals 12, a majority for Labour over the Conservatives of 29. But the uncertainty attached to those forecasts still remains. We can now raise the minimum number of seats we're sure that Labour will have to the 285, 287 sort of mark, but as yet it is by no means clear who is going to get 318 seats, if anybody. The possibilities that were talked about earlier of either party getting 318 or the Liberals holding the centre still remain as far as the computer is predicting.
Well, of course, that result in Nelson and Cone, where David Waddington has presumably held the seat for the Conservatives, that's interesting for another Tory MP, because David Waddington's wife is the daughter of the Tory MP for Preston South, which is extremely marginal, might very well go to Labour, Alan Green.
There's been a poll, actually, a post-poll by the other network there, which suggests a 3.9 swing to Labour, which would have changed the result in Preston South and put Labour in.
We remain to see what happens in Preston South, or indeed Preston North, because they tend sometimes to go together. Anyhow, that's half good news for Alan Green's daughter. Here's the result from Thanet West. West, William Rhys Davies taking the safer of the Thanet seats. He was the old member for Thanet.
Liberals second place, taking slightly more votes from the Labour than the Conservatives there.
Warwick and Leamington, this is Sir Anthony Eden's old seat and a Conservative stronghold.
And quite an appreciable move to Labour there, 5% swing.
Well, as we say, you may have broken out the champagne. We don't blame you if you have, but you can't quite drink in confidence yet. And one of the interesting things for me is that the Liberals so far are projected only to get 12 seats. Now, we haven't yet heard from some of their best options. But Robin Day is talking to a man who is safely home and past the post, Ted Short in Newcastle.
Good morning, Mr. Short.
Good morning, Mr. Day.
I'd like to know what you think of this result so far. On the basis of 27 seats, the projection is, from our computer, Labour 314, Conservative 295, Liberals 12, and the Labour majority over Conservatives 19.
Well, it's exactly the sort of thing we've been predicting. I've been all around the North Country in dozens of marginal seats. I've talked to thousands of people. And I reported to Mr. Wilson tonight that this was the sort of thing I expected.
It's a very high poll. This also is significant, isn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed. People have taken this election very seriously indeed.
What do you think that Mr. Powell's intervention to vote Labour had much effect outside the Midlands?
No, I don't think it had any effect at all in the north of England. Very little indeed, I think, anyhow.
Mr. Short, what do you think, if you're in the Labour cabinet, as you certainly will be, what do you think its very first action will have to be?
Its very first action will have to be to deal with inflation and with prices. Certainly, this is the most important thing of the lot, and with the pensions and with the Industrial Relations Act.
And with the miners' dispute, presumably.
Well, of course, getting Britain back to work. This
Yes.
is job number one. That's in the first few days, of course. Yeah.
Yes. You may get the pay relativities report within a few days, may you not?
Indeed, yes. Yeah.
You look a bit tired, but you look happy, if I may say so.
Well, I'm very happy. I've had one of the most enjoyable election campaigns I've ever had, I think. I've been all around the place in the open air and got a lot of exercise, and I'm feeling tremendously fit.
It was a cold day in Newcastle today.
It's been bitterly cold in Newcastle and a bit of snow, and it's snowing quite heavily now. But fortunately, it didn't snow till about 9:30, so it's been done very well.
Thank you. With the news that Barbara Castle holds Blackburn, may I say good morning to you, Mr. Short.
Good morning, Mr. Day.
And as Robin says, Barbara Castle back in Blackburn, it wouldn't really be the Labour Party if she weren't back, but of course she was in some trouble on the 1970 result, and any appreciable swing to the Conservatives would have put her in very deep trouble this time. However, she's back. Conservatives hold Exeter, the seat has been changed, but then that's one, of course, which they took back from Labour last time, and they've held on to that marginal down there in the southwest. So we are seeing a number of seats which the Tories might have lost had there been a really big swing to Labour across the country. Hanging on. Let's look at that Exeter result. And there's an appropriate name for Labour candidate, Powell there.
It's a comfortable win, but quite likely the Liberals were in the West Country were challenging very hard. They go up 15.4% of their share of the vote and almost take second place in this marginal seat.
Well, quite unfair to Mr. Powell saying that. Here's Lewis Carter-Jones back in Eccles, a Labour stronghold.
And the Liberals got 17% of the vote, which is in fact the lowest vote they've got in any result we've had recorded so far tonight, I think.
And Sir Nigel Fisher, Conservative left-winger, a biographer of Ian MacLeod, again back in his own seat.
And a strong Liberal vote. I'm not a Liberal, and it sounds rather awkward. I keep on stressing the Liberal vote, but it is the most striking thing in the results we've seen this evening.
And here's Rotherham, Labour holding on there. Of course, it's a bit of a mining district around there, but not a very big swing.
74% turnout, up 11%.
And here's Norman Lamont, who held it very well indeed in a by-election after Lord Boyd Carpenter left the seat during the past Parliament, holding his seat.
Another Liberal second place in the London area.
The Anti-Common Market loses deposit.
The outsiders haven't got many votes so far tonight.
And there's Warrington again, no doubt about that result.
But the swing is to Labour there, to the Conservatives. Sorry, no, the swing is 2% to Labour there.
All right, and so we've had a further series of results. One or two good points for Labour, but their lead seems to be coming down a bit, and the Conservatives are fighting quite hard in some of their marginals. Well, now, Bob, we're going to come to you through the night,
Well,
and you better have an answer.
Let's look at the state of the party, shall we now? Remember, there are 416 results to come in tonight. We've only had a handful, really, and the changes are very slight. The Conservatives' loss at Keighley, Labour's loss to Dick Taverne, technically at least, and that's not much to go on. I think myself, on this evidence, that we remember that the Labour Party has to be 70 seats up tonight, because the urban areas are counting first. I think we're moving now toward a situation where the deadlock possibility is very real, but not much chance now of the Tories maintaining an overall majority.
Now, Bob, do you think a lot of seats are going to change hands tonight? Pardon? Do you think a lot of seats are actually going to change hands on these results?
On these results, I think there will be at least some changing hands, certainly, and enough. Remember, after all, a 2% swing knocks out the Conservative majority. Labour is getting at least a 2% swing, and that's the key to the thing so far, I think. Nothing like the swings we were getting around Wolverhampton. Let's look at the share of the vote so far the parties have been getting. Now, you see, these are in 33 results. That's the vote in the first column, vertical column. That's the vote the parties got in these seats last time. The second column is the vote they've got tonight. And you see the Tories have lost 9.4% of the vote they got in 1970. Labour's lost 5% almost. It's almost an unpopularity contest between them, which the Labour Party is winning. And the Liberals have been the big gainers, 13% gain of the vote.
And it remains to be seen whether that Liberal gain, which is taking place in England, will hold up in other parts of the country, like Scotland and Wales, where the Liberals are challenged by the Nationalists. We'll have a look at some results now, which are safely in over the transom. There's Barbara Castle's result in Blackburn, and safely back. So, there we are. Barbara Castle gives you the complete answer to any problems about her. She'll be back, and if Mr. Wilson is forming a government, we can be pretty sure that she's going to be in it. And so let's have a look now at Battersea North, where Douglas Jay is the Labour sitting candidate.
Parliamentary election in the Wandsworth Battersea North constituency. J. Douglas Patrick Thomas, Labour, 18,503. Randall Simon James Crawford, Conservative, 8,080. Reeks Carroll, Communist Party of England, Leninist Marxist, 208. Saville John Lee Henry, Liberal, 4,683. And I hereby declare that the Right Honourable Douglas Patrick Thomas J. is duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency.
Well, Mr. Deputy Town Clerk, I only want very briefly tonight to thank you and all your staff for your conduct of this count and conduct for the whole of the election, which I'm sure has satisfied all of us of all schools of thought from left to right. I've heard so many complaints about everything under the sun today, from the weather to our whole electoral system, that I expect there may be a few complaints even about the way this election has been conducted. But I'm not mentioning them tonight. I would like to thank all my supporters for this vote of confidence, for which I am extremely grateful, having tried to serve this...
A slight swing to the Conservatives, I think, in Battersea North. Hardly any change at all, though a big increase in the Liberal share of the vote in this safe Labour seat.
And Douglas Jay, anyway, back. Of course, he's one of the leaders of the anti-European movement inside the Labour Party, and indeed left Mr. Wilson's cabinet when Mr. Wilson was deep in negotiation about getting into Europe. Well, now we have an opportunity, and I must eat my words. When things are going badly for the Conservatives, I said, they don't speak very much. So let's go now. Lord Carrington, who is the chairman of the Conservative Party, of course, is there talking now to Alan Watson.
Lord Carrington, Bob Mackenzie on our programme has said that on the computer predictions it seems that the Conservatives now have little chance of a working majority in the next Parliament. Do you accept that?
Well, I don't know whether the computers are any better than the opinion polls. We shall have to wait and see.
Well, the computer's coming up with a different result from the opinion polls, isn't it?
Well, I don't know whether it's more accurate. But I think so far, from our point of view, the results have been rather disappointing.
How disappointing?
Oh, fairly disappointing, but I think it's early days yet, and I think, we must wait and see what happens.
One pattern that seems to have emerged fairly clearly is that the Liberals are taking heavily from you, especially in the southeast of England. Now, was that what you expected?
Oh, I think that we always expected the Liberals would run second to us in the south of England. I didn't think that this would happen in the north, and I think I'd like to see a bit more of what happens in the north of England before I'm perfectly certain what does happen. But I always thought that in the south the Liberals would be second to us, and they haven't won a seat yet.
No, sure, but if the Liberals do tend to take from you in the southeast, in your strong areas, not proportionately from the Labour Party,
right, yeah.
that would point to a Conservative defeat.
And this, I think, is the reason for such Labour swing as there's been. I don't think there's a swing to Labour. I think that so far we've seen the Liberals taking more from the Conservatives than from Labour.
Well, Mr. Heath has repeatedly emphasised, particularly towards the end of this campaign, that he wanted a firm mandate, and indeed this was the whole point of having an election now. But it already seems fairly clear that there won't be a mandate of that kind. Do you therefore think the timing of this election was miscalculated?
Well, let's just wait and see what happens. I think you're jumping your fences. How many results have we had? Can't remember now.
No, but we've had enough to obviously give those particular projections.
Well, we've had enough for the computers, but I don't know that I've had enough for me.
As far as you're concerned, do you feel now, in view of what's happened so far this evening, that the main issue that you wanted to get across in this election, namely who governs Britain and the need for a firm government, has got across?
And the need for an incomes policy. Well, we shall have to wait and see what the people thought. I mean, it's silly to say that I think it did if it's proved that it didn't. I mean, that's an idiotic thing to say.
So
but I would have thought myself, if you'd asked me this morning, I would have said yes.
So you're disappointed, but you're certainly not conceding?
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Well, Lord Carrington doesn't like the computer very much, but we'd better show it to him now. It's really quite innocuous. The results come in and they're processed and we give them. There's one interesting result it hasn't got yet. You saw there that the Conservatives have taken Plymouth Sutton. But here, Nelson Cone, this is David Waddington holding on to the seat which he won in 1970.
This must be a slight disappointment for the Liberals. They only got 22% of the vote there, and they had hoped to win it as a target.
And Newcastle upon Tyne East, Labour holding.
That's not surprising, but a slight swing to Labour, 1%.
And there's Neville Sanderson holding his seat. He fought many by-elections. Perhaps he's very glad to be comfortably situated.
6.5% of the vote for the National Front.
And here's a big one now, David. Sir Arthur Irvine holding Liverpool Edge Hill against a Liberal offensive and holding it quite comfortably.
Liberals got second place, but they were way back. Now, this must be a great disappointment. A 20% margin for Sir Arthur Irvine.
And here's the Conservatives taking Plymouth Sutton, which is a new seat. They would have taken it in 1970, of course.
Virtually no change from what we guessed would have happened last time. The Liberals got 26% of the vote, taken equally from both parties.
So, there we are. That's the situation. Now, let's go to Huyton, which is Mr. Wilson's seat. After all, he's the man who appears to be in the driving seat, however temporarily, according to our computer. And let's see what the situation is in the count at Huyton.
Mr. Wilson is just about to arrive here in the Leisure Hall at Huyton. He's left his hotel, where he's been spending the last couple of hours, and there's been a complete transformation of the atmosphere here in Huyton. It looked a little bit like a wake earlier on today, and it hasn't quite got to the celebration stage, but people are obviously very excited as they wait for the leader of the Labour Party and the former Prime Minister, and who knows, perhaps the next Prime Minister, to arrive here for his own count in Huyton. You're looking out now into the darkness of what's been a cold and very bleak day here in Huyton. It all looks a bit like Z cars out there now, with about half the Liverpool police force here, which is always a sign of something important happening, and the increased importance attached to Mr. Wilson at this moment. And we're just waiting for him to come through the door, and from here he'll go into the hall itself for the count. These are some, I assume, of the outriders of his party. Is he out there yet? Has he arrived? Have you seen him? He's just arrived, has he? Well, it's worthwhile hanging on, I think, Alistair, just for a moment. I'll try and stop him at the doorway here and have a word with him for you. I don't know if that's going to be possible. It's unusual for the leaders in this position at this time to say anything at all. We expect to be speaking to Mr. Wilson a little later on, of course, after the count. The poll is declared here at Huyton, but I'll try and have a word with him at the door here. and see if he's a little more cheerful, as I imagine he really must be by now, than he looked at the end of what's been a very tiring campaign for him earlier here in the day. He has been up and down to London today. He was in Huyton this morning, and flew to London, flew back again after having voted in London, and he's been touring the constituency here all day, going into the Labour clubs and the committee rooms, talking to the party workers, and here are the cheers outside. As Mr. Wilson, I can see in myself now, I suppose you can too, yes? I'm just seeing the pictures that you've been watching for some time, but I haven't been able to see it for people clustered around the television set themselves. And I'll try and have a word with him. Mr. Wilson, you look a very much more cheerful man than you looked earlier tonight. I say you look a very much more cheerful man. Mr. Wilson, in case you didn't hear that, said he had no idea what was going on in the count. But he looks a very much more cheerful man than I saw earlier today anyway. There he disappears round the corner. And we'll be back here, I should imagine, in about 15 minutes for the declaration of his poll, if not sooner, and perhaps have a word with him then. Meanwhile, back to Alistair Burnett in London.
Well, thank you, Michael. And there's Mr. Wilson. It takes one back to the days in 1964 when Mr. Wilson was becoming Prime Minister. Labour taking that new seat there in Luton East. Mr. Wilson, of course, not sure, quite wisely saying he doesn't know what's going on because there's a few things to be settled tonight. Now, while we were up there with Michael Charlton at Huyton, and the result there is expected in a short while, you'll notice a second reverse for the Liberals at Liverpool Toxteth, where Mr. Trevor Jones, who's been the whiz-kid of their revival in Liverpool, has failed to take that. You also notice a bit of a reverse for Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalists in Anglesey, where Mr. Cledwyn Hughes, former Secretary of State for Wales, has held his seat there. A success for Labour at Eton and Slough, where Joan Lester, a member of the National Executive Committee, is back. And a success for the Conservatives at Wallasey, where Linda Chalker has taken over Ernest Marple's formerly safe seat. So that's the situation. Let's look at some of these results in full. And here's Arthur Bottomley back, former Colonial Secretary, pro-European.
We reckon that a biggish swing, in fact, to the Conservatives. 4% to the Conservatives in this Steel seat.
Manchester Ardwick, Gerald Kaufman, who of course was Mr. Wilson's personal assistant and secretary, back again in Manchester Ardwick.
Liberals only 14% of the vote, mainly from the Conservatives.
Eton and Slough, this is the Joan Lester result on the National Executive. A good result there for her, I would say, because the Conservatives took this seat as recently as 1964.
And that's most significant because that's one more case where a seat hasn't changed. The Liberals have taken their votes from the lower, weaker party, the challenging party.
And here's Mrs. Linda Chalker back in Wallasey. That was Ernest Marple's seat. They said Marples must go, or he said he had to go, and now it's Linda Chalker. 23% for the Liberals. Hardly any swing. And here's Barnsley, Roy Mason. Barnsley, of course, a very strong mining area. Roy Mason, the Labour spokesman on fuel. A swing of under 1% in the first mining seat we've heard from, I think. And here's Hastings, a safe Conservative seat. And the Liberals in third place in a seat they might have had some hopes in. They got 26% of the vote. And Hugh DeLarge back in Thurrock, an earthquake if he hadn't been. Liberals 22%, just behind the Conservatives. And here's David Ginsburg again, back in Dewsbury. He hasn't caught Mr. Wilson's eye for office. I wonder if he will now. Another low swing in a South Yorkshire seat. Well, that's the situation, a further run of results, and it does seem now to be a bit of a sluggish election, not many seats changing hands. Interesting in Liverpool, the Liberals still have one chance there, but they certainly haven't made the big breakout which they had been talking. And so we may have one of the more sluggish election results, but at the moment still going on Labour's way. Well, we were saying earlier on tonight that, of course, it's not all joy and celebration or anything like that. In Belfast, we had the bombs going off, and we have film now from Belfast of those incidents. Here's Wendy Fisher reporting.
The multiple bombing attack in Belfast began around 9 o'clock after what had been a comparatively quiet day in Ulster. There was a warning call to a post office, but within minutes, small bombs started exploding in litter bins and under manhole covers. The first bombs were all in the vicinity of City Hall, but within an hour, car bombs start exploding at the rate of 1 every 15 minutes. The car bombs did not injure anyone, although several shops and office properties have been severely damaged. First reports of casualties came after a dockside pub was blown up. A customer in the bar was killed, and it's feared that a woman has lost both legs. 2 men threw the bomb into the doorway. There were about 12 customers inside. The bartender tried to lead his customers outside, but the 2 who were injured could not get out in time. No warning was given for this bomb attack.
Well, that's the very sad story from Belfast tonight. And, of course, we don't get any results from Northern Ireland until tomorrow, partly with that sort of thing in mind. Just a result here, Hugh Jenkins holding Putney against Jerry Wade, a strong Conservative challenge, and I don't think that Jenkins would have held it in 1970, David.
I think it would have been difficult, but it has been affected by redistribution.
We must go, I'm sorry, we must go to Battersea South for the result.
778. John Michael Clifton, National Front, 787. Gerard Anthony Mulholland, Liberal, 5,919, and Ernest George Perry, 14,441. And I hereby declare that Ernest George Perry has been duly elected to serve as a member for the constituency.
Mr. Milling, fellow candidates.
Well, there is Labour holding on to a seat that the Conservatives had some hope of. Better redistribution had made Battersea South a very much better bet for the Conservatives, and they did, after all, hold it from 1951 to 64. This is certainly bad news for Labour, for the Conservatives, if they hope for any breakthrough in the inner London area, and that on top of Putney, which, no, not a big swing, but is something that does suggest the national pattern, a swing of about 2% over the whole country, London and the rest of the country, except for the Midlands, where we've got a much different picture, 9% swing still, with most of that due to the Wolverhampton thing.
Well, I think we have to wait there, David, don't we, to see what happens in Birmingham. That follows Wolverhampton.
Recount at Northampton South, which is one of these new seats in Northampton that was thought to be just on the margin.
And they could decide the election. I think there's been some thoughts. Well, now, Ernest Perry, of course, there in Battersea South, a Labour whip back. Let's look at some of the results. Here's Luton East, and Simeons, the Conservative, who was a former member for Luton, chose this one to fight, and he failed to take it.
That really does count as a Labour gain. It's the second gain of the night after Keighley, the first Labour gain.
And there we have Labour taking Stockport South after the recount. I think we said that Stockport North after the recount. I think we said that the Conservative was plainly in trouble, and that therefore is the second seat that the Conservatives have lost to Labour tonight so far, as indeed the swing would indicate that they should.
That was the third seat, so we just announced there, the Stockport one. And if Labour's only gained 3 seats in 55 results, we don't quite know where they've all come from so far, but 3 seats in 55 isn't quite going to be enough to push them over the magic 318, but we may well pattern
change. Here, David, is a very marginal Upminster, one of the most marginal seats in the country, and the Conservatives have taken it.
Well, that offsets Putney. We both said that Putney and Upminster were the 2 London seats that were really too close to calculate. They were redistributed. What would have happened in 1970 isn't clear.
Here's John Loveridge, who, of course, a previous member, but not for Upminster, and he's taken this one. His wisdom was right.
We think, on our calculations, that the Conservative vote went down only 6% and the Labour vote down 7.5%, but it really was a difficult calculation, and we're not sure. The Liberals, 22% there in Upminster.
It's very wise of us to have Julian Wilson on the show. It is becoming a horse race, no question about it. Conservatives holding Newcastle upon Tyne North. Well, there's the situation. We have some more results. And I think we have a big name here, Tony Crossland, of course, who's been Labour's spokesman on the environment, who would certainly have hopes of high office if a new Labour government were formed.
And it's comfortably back, and obviously the Liberals cut in heavily. They got 24% of the vote cut into the Conservative challenge.
And here's Battersea South, Ernest Perry's result, which we saw direct from the spot, holding the seat quite safely.
4% swing to the Labour Party there.
There was, in fact, a swing to Conservative in Tony Crossland's seat, wasn't there?
No, I know. It was...
I thought I saw it.
Yes,
anyway,
sir.
there we are. Sir Keith Joseph back in Leeds North East, and of course the Social Services Secretary retaining his seat. Again, something very peculiar would have happened if Sir Keith had not done so. We'll have some details in a moment. So, there we have the situation. Let's look at what the Labour Party has picked up with the swing towards it tonight. Stronger in the north than in the south. Labour has taken Keighley, it's taken the new seat of Luton East, it has taken Stockport North, and again Battersea South, which it would not have taken in 1970.
On its new boundaries.
So, there we are, and Graham...
See, secondary counted Ipswich. Now,
secondary,
Ipswich was the most marginal seat at the last election, where it had a margin of 13. There cannot be much of a swing in Ipswich.
That's Mr. Ernal Money there, who is quite a doughty fighter, and...
We saw his wife earlier in the programme, don't you remember? Milking
That's right,
the cow.
milking. Here's Mr. Wilson now at Huyton, and he's walking through the count. We saw him arriving there with Michael Charlton early on. It does take one back to 1964, when Mr. Wilson heard the result at Smethwick, which the Conservatives took against the swing, and he was extremely nervous then whether he was going to be Prime Minister, and he cannot, I think, now be wholly sure that he's going to be Prime Minister, or certainly Prime Minister with a majority. With the news that Labour is holding its seat in Carlisle, Graham, am I doing Mr. Wilson an injustice? What are his chances of becoming Prime Minister again?
Well, we have over 70 results processed through the computer now, and as you can see, the predicted number of Labour seats is 314. Less than enough to give a majority over all parties. The Conservatives predicted to have 297, Liberals down to 10. On the slidometer, we can show that the uncertainty is being reduced. The gap is narrowing, and we're still on the brink of being able to eliminate the possibility that the Conservatives might have the necessary 318 to form an overall majority. But it is still wide open. The computer is not yet certain what sort of a parliament we're going to have.
Well, if the computer is not certain, perhaps we don't have any really comforting words for Mr. Wilson yet, but you have no real comforting words for Mr. Heath, have you?
No, indeed. The prediction is that Labour are ahead and that they will be the largest party in the new House of Commons.
Well, let's have a look at some of the results which we've had while Graham was speaking. Here's the result from Stockport North, that marginal, which the Conservatives lost after the recount. Mr. Andrew Bennett, a schoolmaster, taking the seat. Mr. Idris Owen, who won it in 1970, losing it.
The second narrowest majority we've had so far tonight.
And here's Stockport South, Maurice Orbach holding the seat.
Both those seats a swing of 1% to Labour, less than we've been having in the other parts of the northwest.
Now, here's the first result we've had from Birmingham so far. Roy Hattersley, who of course has been a controversial spokesman on education, former defence spokesman and junior minister in defence, safely back in his seat.
A big swing to Labour, but nothing like as big as in Wolverhampton.
And there's Cledwyn Hughes, Secretary of State for Wales and the Labour government back, and Plaid Cymru coming third.
And this is the first result we've had from Wales. You can't make much of a pattern of it, but the pop singer standing for Plaid Cymru only got 21% of the vote, less than last time.
Christchurch and Lymington, the safe Conservative seat on the south coast.
Liberals second. Mr. Adley moved from Bristol North East to there.
So let's go now to Birmingham, where there's a result, I think, at Ladywood.
Yes, and here in Birmingham Ladywood, we're just waiting for the result. The latest news from Birmingham Ladywood is that the Labour Party are claiming a sweeping victory here, talking in terms of a 10,000 majority, and already the Conservative candidate, Richard Lawn, has conceded victory to Brian Walden, the Labour candidate. The result about to be declared by the Lady Mayor, Mrs. Marjorie Brown.
Parliamentary election, Birmingham Ladywood constituency. I, the undersigned, being the returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Alastair Brian Walden,
Labour.
15,126. Richard Lawn,
Conservative.
6,164. Kenneth George Hardiman,
Liberal.
3,753. John Alfred Alexandra Davis, 751. The majority of 8,962 for Alastair Brian Walden, and that the above-mentioned person has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency. Thank you.
He's a most eloquent and able debater.
A 7% swing to Labour in Birmingham.
Thank you.
There in Brown Walden. 7% higher than in Sparkbrook. It does seem the West Midlands are different from the rest of the country. Is it Mr. Powell or not? We don't know.
Mr. Powell will claim that. Michael Stewart, the former Labour Foreign Secretary, holding his old seat. And let's go now to Devon North and hear the fortunes of Jeremy Thorpe.
Barnstaple for the returning officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pine Coffin, is there up on the platform here at Devon North with the three candidates. This, of course, is Jeremy Thorpe's seat, where he's defending a majority of 369 against the Conservative Tim Keighley and the Labour man Tony Marston. Fairly soon now.
Well, we see Mr. Thorpe there in expectation of his success. Mr. Wilson sitting there in the gallery waiting to see what's... Of course, he knows he's back in Huyton, but he doesn't know if he's back with an overall majority. Just a little lift of the eyebrows there. Now back to Mr. Thorpe, who might, of course, join him in a coalition government if they could reach the right sort of terms. Mr. Thorpe, who's been speaking to the nation from his seat throughout the election, made great personal success, and the polls have shown his success. Here we are at Huyton, I think, for the result.
I, the undersigned, being the Deputy Acting Returning Officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Thomas Yates Bennion,
Conservative,
16,462. I'm sorry, I'll have to hold you a second. I promised I'd have the press in, and we've overlooked it. Will the press please come forward now? And the photographers over here. I'm sorry about that.
Well, here's Huyton wringing the last ounce of drama out of its poll here tonight. Press are already here, I'm sure, but Mr. Wilgoose, the returning officer, is extending an unusual amount of courtesy to us. And
over there.
At moments like this, and all the photographers will be taking the still pictures of Mr. Wilson that you'll be seeing in the morning papers.
Here are the figures again. Thomas Yates Bennion, 16,462.
He was the Conservative.
Harold Smith, 234.
Independent.
Neil Francis Eccles Snowden, 7,584. James Harold Wilson, 31,767.
That's a huge majority from Mr. Wilson.
One out, one out. I declare that the said James Harold Wilson has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency of Huyton.
Knowlton, 22,980.
Conservative.
Marston, Terence Kendrick, 6,140. Thorpe, John Jeremy, 34,052.
Well, Mr. Returning Officer, ladies and gentlemen, may I say at the outset that this is the most extraordinary constituency in the United Kingdom, because one's majority is always very much smaller or very much larger than one had anticipated when one came into the count. But I would like to thank you, Mr. Returning Officer, and your staff, not only for the very speedy way in which this count has been concluded, and when one considers that we are talking of an area of 600 square miles, we will, I think, have created a record for a large county seat. To thank you and all your staff, may I thank all my workers, all those who have voted for me, and say that I am very proud and very privileged to continue to have the responsibility for representing the interests of this constituency. Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, a real personal success in that seat.
Labour lost their deposit. Mr. Thorpe put his vote up by 11% on an 87% poll, the highest we've had recorded, higher than any vote in any turnout in the last election.
We saw there the Conservatives holding Uxbridge, which is one of their near marginals or marginals to the west of London. There's a recount, however, at Rochester and Chatham. That's a seat which they took from Labour. I think Mrs. Peggy Fenner perhaps in trouble there. She's responsible for looking after prices, isn't she?
Yes, and a recount at Plymouth Devonport, where two MPs are fighting, Joan Vickers and David Owen.
And David Owen. So there's plenty to go here. Labour with Manchester Moss side. That's an old Conservative seat, but with redistribution, it didn't look at all safe there for Frank Taylor, and it appears that he has lost it. One would have expected that, given the shape of the results so far tonight. We'll have a little look at some of the results, and then we'll be looking at Mr. Wilson's acceptance speech there at Carlisle. That has been Conservative, of course, in the not too distant past, but looks safely Labour tonight.
3% to Labour in Carlisle, which is just in the heart of Mr. Whitelaw's constituency.
And now we're getting a Labour gain at Ilford South, and this is one which Labour is picking up there. This is one which had looked a bit dicey. There has been some changes, and Labour have taken it.
Mr. Shaw was beaten by Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper has beaten Mr. Shaw back again, then back again, third time.
And the second Luton seat, a new seat, and Labour have held it. We suspect they would have taken it in 1970.
Liberals had some hopes here. Well, they did get 26% of the vote, but are some way back.
Here's Plymouth Drake, Miss Fuchs, who is a bit of a refugee from the London area, but she saw this seat, she was adopted for it, and she made a wise move perhaps tonight.
And that's actually a swing to the Conservatives, has to be reckoned as that, I think.
Interesting with Devonport in mind. And here's Mrs. Peggy Oppenheim back in a marginal, Gloucester, which she won last time, and she's back really quite safely.
And the Liberals must have taken votes from Labour there, because there's a distinct swing, 3.7 to the Conservatives. When you see swing without the word to anyone, it's swing to Conservative.
And here's Keith Joseph back, perhaps not to be Secretary for Social Services, but back in his Leeds North East seat.
And here's a swing to Labour, 6.1, a very big swing, biggest swing we've had in Yorkshire.
There we are. Let's look then at the Labour record so far tonight. The seats that may be taking Mr. Well, we have a little look at the Ronda there for a moment, but these are the seats which may be taking Mr. Wilson back to number 10 Downing Street. Keighley, which is a capture, Luton East, Stockport North, Battersea South, which they wouldn't have had in 1970, and Ilford South, a capture tonight. Here's Mr. Wilson speaking now at Huyton.
Mr. Acting Returning Officer, fellow candidates and friends, once again it is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks to you, Mr. Wilgoose, on the always expeditious way in which you've carried out this count, and as I've just seen at the table, to the satisfaction of all the candidates. I'm sure that others will want to support me in this, but it is a very great pleasure to say how well this has been done. And inevitably, this is rather in the national eye, and that is why we're all proud of the way it is done in this constituency. I apologize to my fellow candidates for being late arriving. It was not, I'm afraid, my own fault. But I do want to say this. This campaign throughout the country, and certainly in this constituency, has been fought with great fairness and very great seriousness. I believe the electorate has formed its own view of the issues in the election. I'm not going to go over them tonight, but I think the electorate has viewed these issues in a deeply mature way, deeply concerned for the future of our country, however the result may turn out when we hear them from other constituencies. I want particularly to thank my colleagues, the other candidates, and to the other parties for the part they have played in this. Again,
Mr. Wilson there, his speech at Huyton. Not quite sure what he's coming back to London for, but we must go to Sutton and Cheam now for the result there. This was a Liberal gain of the by-election.
The result of the Sutton and Cheam constituency, I, Neil Burton Mitchell, Being the Deputy Acting Returning Officer for the parliamentary constituency of Sutton and Cheam, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Macfarlane David Neil,
Conservative,
22,555. Rhodes James Kenneth,
Labour,
6,270. Tope Graham Norman,
Liberal,
20,836. And that Macfarlane David Neil has been duly elected to serve as a Member of Parliament for the constituency.
Well, there's Mr. Macfarlane. He lost it at the by-election. He fought again, and he's taken it back from Graham Tope.
And that is obviously a great blow to the Liberals. They have done well in votes this evening, but now they've lost one seat. They've held Jeremy Thorpe. Jeremy Thorpe's held his seat with a much increased majority, but this must be a great disappointment to them, and disappointment to the 3 or 4 other seats they might have hoped to pick up in London if Graham Tope can't hold on.
Well, of course, there are 1 or 2 which could come, but let's hear the speeches from them.
But I believe that the many employees of the Sutton Borough Council have done so much hard work today. The Count here and all those people who worked throughout the day have produced a most swift result, a cliff-hanging result, and a most excellent one for the Conservative Party here in Sutton and Cheam. I want to express my appreciation for all the work that has been done for the Conservative Party here, and I believe that this result augurs well, not only for us locally, but nationally. It's too early for us to say at this stage what is going to happen elsewhere, but I'm delighted. I look forward to acting as the Member of Parliament for the whole of this borough and representing all 61,000 constituents. Thank you for your support, thank you for your time this evening, and thank you for a splendid result.
So there's the victor, Mr. Neil Macfarlane, at Sutton and Cheam, and of course a reverse for the Liberals there. 1 or 2 other small points of comfort for the Conservatives while we were away out of the studio. The Conservatives have held, as you saw, Cardiff North after a recount. They've also held Hampstead, another seat which they took in 1970 and would have been vulnerable had there been a serious swing to Labour. On Labour's side, Andrew Foles, one of the most colourful characters, a histrionic character almost in the House of Commons, back in Whalley East, and he could have been in a little bit of trouble there.
But he got a 10% swing, as big as anything except Wolverhampton.
But he's again in that Midlands area, and I think Mr. Powell, David, having said that he won the last election for Mr. Heath, is saying he's jolly well lost this one for Mr. Heath.
I think that's very likely. So, incidentally, there was another blow for the Liberals there, in that Labour has held on to Charlie Pannell's old seat, Leeds West, where they had hoped that Michael Meadowcroft would make headway if they made any in that area.
Well now, Graham, what's the new story from the computer that Lord Carrington doesn't like, but seems to be holding up fairly well?
Well, there's no new story. We have over 100 results in, though, and as you can see, the predicted Labour majority over Conservative is down to 10. That means that 5 seats going the opposite direction to what the computer expects would produce neck and neck. So Labour are still predicted ahead, but it's very, very close.
So that's 10 seats at just coming up to 10 minutes past 1.
There's one trend I'd like to draw attention to. We've had 3 marginals in the West Country. Every one of them has shown a slight swing to the Conservatives. Cyril Smith back in Rochdale. That's the second Liberal seat tonight.
And that's one that he did take at the by-election, and he's held it obviously against Labour.
Yes, that's one that Labour would certainly have hoped to win in a good evening. But
And Labour holding Oldham West, that's Michael Meacher, who of course is interested in social security matters. He could have been in trouble had there been any swing to the Conservatives in the country at large, but he's back again.
He had a very big swing, the biggest one in the North East.
Well now, on the battleground stands Robert Mackenzie, and what do you see there, Bob?
Well, if there'd been any swing to the Conservatives, those are the seats, the kind of seats Labour would have lost, and in fact they're holding that type of seat. But what becomes quite fascinating is the way the battle is being fought back and forth in this area. Swing up to Labour is around 2% on average nationally, and on that basis they would be expected to carry far more of this group than they have. Conservatives held seats like this, which are thought to have been ready to go down. Labour did take this one, and then has taken Stockport, Whalley, and Ilford South, and has even forged right over this far at Luton East. But quite strikingly, the pattern is very mixed here, although moving in Labour's favour rather than the favour of the Conservatives. On the Liberal picture, a sad story, really, because they've done very well on average, but not always where their votes count. Losing Sutton and Cheam, holding Rochdale, holding Jeremy Thorpe's seat handsomely, not winning Liverpool, where they thought they'd do well. The two seats they had an excellent chance in their own view. And they now, on our prediction, will not get into the two figures of the 20 they had expected. And certainly no takeoff of the kind we talked about earlier in the evening. And
so there's the Liberals, and what began as a good night for them, as Bob's saying, not too good. Labour holding Hartlepool. Well, again, that has been Conservative within living memory, but of course no swing to the Conservatives there. Let's perhaps have a look at some of the results which are coming through with our computer and keeping up to the mark, giving us a very, very interesting cliff-hanging election tonight with nobody quite knowing what is happening. Labour taking that seat in Dudley West, which they wouldn't have had in 1970, so that does seem, I think, to build up Mr. Wilson's confidence slightly, but no sooner as one announce something like that than you find something which becomes a problem and a difficulty. Look at some of the results now, and here we are up in the northwest.
And these three seats actually show about the average swing for the northwest. About 2.7 is the average swing, Bootle and Gorton just a little above that.
And 3 seats in Liverpool where the Liberals haven't done as well as they wanted.
They got 15% of the vote only in Kirkdale, 22% in Toxteth.
And staying in the northwest, interesting there in Crewe, Mrs. Gwyneth Dunwoody, who lost in the southwest last time, back in a safe seat.
Again, all fairly near a steady average swing of 2.5%.
And now over the Pennines to Yorkshire.
Lower swings there in Yorkshire. The average for Yorkshire is 1.2 and they're about that. Except, sorry, Batley and Morley is a swing to the Conservatives. It's against the tide.
And we'll look at Cyril Smith's success in Rochdale. He's done really very well there, consolidating the by-election success.
It's a bigger majority percentage-wise than it was in the by-election. Quite a big 4% for the National Front. I think it's...
And here in Dudley West, Fergus Montgomery, a former member, he's actually been beaten out of the House twice now.
Yes, he had a great fight for the nomination in southwest Staffordshire and failed there, and now has failed in the neighbouring Dudley West.
So that's some results. Not many surprises there. Some familiar faces, Mrs. Dunwoody, for example, back in the House of Commons. We've had a little note that one of the opinion polls, the Business Decisions in the Observer, say that they've got this result right. Not all pollsters, they say, are wrong. Shirley Summerskill holds Halifax, which is one the Tories had some hopes for. Let's look at the state of the parties at this stage, with the Conservatives 7 losses, Labour 5 gains. And that's the situation then at 1:15. The Conservatives 7 losses, Labour 5 net gains, and the Liberals not quite doing as well as they would have hoped at this particular time. This gives us an opportunity, I think, to have a look at how things are going in the southeast. We'll have a look at Graham Tope, who was the Liberal who took Sutton and Cheam at the by-election. He lost it this time. Let's see how he's taken that defeat.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I must start by congratulating Mr. Macfarlane. I wish him well in his time, which I think will be short, as Member of Parliament for Sutton and Cheam. May I say that in the 14 months in which I have had the honour, and it has been an honour, to represent Sutton, Cheam and Worcester Park, that I have thoroughly enjoyed those 14 months, that I am deeply grateful to the many, many people in this constituency who've worked extremely hard for the Liberals. And thank you, John. And let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that only 3.5 years ago the Liberals polled 14% in this constituency, so we have still seen a remarkable Liberal upsurge. I have met many, many people during the last 14 months, wonderful people here in Sutton and Cheam, not all of them Liberals by any means. I intend to remain in Sutton and Cheam. It's my home. It will remain as my home, and I shall carry on working here for what we and the Liberals have tried to do here, and we're going to carry on trying to do it.
I think we ought to. Here in the southeast, excluding London, which we'll look at separately, it's of course very strong Tory territory traditionally. So far the Conservatives have got 6, the blue ones, and Labour 5. One of those for Labour represents, again, Luton East, which they're no doubt very pleased about indeed, but basically it looks as if the Tories will be able to hold that great blue area they ordinarily have and will not fall to the Liberals, as some thought they might. Liberals running very well, though, with 25% of the vote in the area, but not enough to the real breakthrough they've been hoping for. The kind of things they hoped for were these seats, and of course already the Conservatives have held Tunbridge Wells and Sutton and Cheam. And have rather recaptured Sutton and Cheam. That's been a great disappointment for the Liberals, undoubtedly. In the Greater London area, so far we've got 25 results, Conservatives 10, Labour 15, and included there are 2 Labour gains, Battersea South and Ilford South. And the Liberals haven't yet scored, of course. Now they've not been successful in Sutton and Cheam. On the sort of swings we're getting nationally, we would expect a Labour swing to bring down some of these constituencies, and yet, curiously enough, this mixed pattern we've had nationally of the Conservatives holding up Minster, which is very vulnerable, Hampstead very vulnerable, yet Labour picking up 2 up here. And the other way, Labour holding its most marginal seat, Putney. Back to Ulster.
Well, now let's have a look at some of the results in the London area, which we haven't picked up yet. Interesting there that Pat Hornsby-Smith, who left Chislehurst to fight up in the Midlands, she might have held it.
And the Liberals got between 20 and 25% of the vote in each of those 3 seats.
And 3 safe Labour seats.
Actual swing to the Conservatives in Hammersmith North, but the swing in London as a whole is about 2.1%. These are other ones, and yeah.
And here are some really quite expected results. Michael Shersby, however, the victor of the by-election, holding Uxbridge again.
That's good news for the Conservatives in a seat they might have been worried in. It was, after all, a Labour seat from 64 to 70.
And there's Norman Atkinson, constant competitor for the treasurership of the Labour Party against Mr Callaghan back in Tottenham.
Slightly higher votes swings there to Labour.
And here's the Andrew Falls result. Mr Falls, as I was saying, very histrionic man, but obviously very much, I think, on the right wing of the Labour Party, a critic of Mr Wilson's over Europe, and he's really very safely back in a seat which he might have had some trouble in.
We reckon that as a 10% swing to the Labour Party, and there are 2 Wolverhampton seats with bigger swings, 16% of Mr Powell's old seat to the swing to Labour, but nothing else on that scale anywhere else in the country. About 6 or 7% is the highest we've had recorded anywhere else.
Well, it's interesting now, Smethwick, of course, is in that area. Mr Falls was the member, and yet in that situation, race appears to have played no part in this election.
There's been very little race in this election, all told.
And at the moment, we're saying that the Labour have a lead over the Conservatives of 45, with 490 seats to come. But although the edge, I think, so far has been held by Labour, and that confirms it, they're taking their Bolton East. That's the seat that Lawrence Reid took last time. That's another regain from the Conservatives since 1970. The edge is to Labour, but we can't quite predict that it is for sure a Labour government that's going to come into power at the weekend. And there's Liberals taking a success at Hazel Grove. That's one, of course, which they had their eyes on up there in the northwest. They have actually taken it this time. That's Michael Winstanley.
Yeah, that's major comfort for them, because the Liverpool news has been so bad for them.
Well, there's with the news of a Liberal success up in the northwest, Robin Day is talking to Jeremy Thorpe.
Good morning, Mr Thorpe.
Good morning, Robin. How are you?
May I just tell you that Michael Winstanley has won Hazel Grove?
Yes, I've just heard.
I didn't know whether you were with us, but you did very well down there in North Devon, didn't you?
That's kind of you, yes. Well, we've shored things up a bit.
Now, do you understand what's happening nationally? You see, our computer projects... Mr Thorpe, I apologise, we must go to Sidcup.
You must go to Sidcup?
We'll come back to you later.
Certainly. Bon voyage.
I hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Bennett, Donald Clifford Tyndall,
Independent Democrat,
613. Hargrave Colin Francis.
Labour.
10,750. Heath Edward Richard George.
Conservative Prime Minister.
20,448. Moxon Oliver Charles Napier. 9,847. And that Edward Richard George Heath has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency.
May I thank you, Mr. Acting Returning Officer, for the way in which you and your staff have conducted the poll today. To thank all those who have assisted you here this evening, all those who have been in the polling stations throughout the day, including the police who have been there with them. May I also thank the other candidates in this campaign for the way in which the election here in Bexley Sidcup has been conducted, in which we have been able to discuss the problems of this country and the solutions which we put forward for it in a way in which has enabled the electorate to come to our meetings, to ask us questions, and then to form their own judgments about it. And finally, may I thank all my supporters, both here tonight and outside in the constituency, for the support which they have given to me, recognizing that I had duties elsewhere to perform at the same time. And so I would like to thank them very sincerely for the confidence which they have placed in me here as the candidate, the Conservative candidate, in the new constituency of Bexley Sidcup.
Mr. Heath there, of course, safely back in his seat. But on his face, I think, the look of a man who does not expect to be Prime Minister
and a slight
again.
Swing to the Conservatives there. Mr. Heath does seem to have a personal vote. His vote went down less in the Liberal uprise than the Labour vote went down.
However, these are still early days. There were 2 or 3 interesting results there, which you may have noticed. Cyril Carr failing for the Liberals at Wavertree, in fact coming bottom of the poll. Plymouth Devonport, a most important success for the Labour Party there. David Owen, who, of course, was fighting there. Another sitting MP, Dame Joan Vickers, but David Owen for Labour taking that seat. And as we saw, Anthony Barber, the Chancellor, back, but perhaps again no longer to be Chancellor. Well, now, we must apologise for having left Mr. Jeremy Thorpe and Robin Day to bring you the Prime Minister's, perhaps even now the former Prime Minister's result. Mr. Heath must make up his own mind about this election. Back to you, Robin.
Mr. Thorpe, if we may carry on where we left off, our computer prediction shows Liberals 18 and a Labour majority over Conservatives of only 9, with 306 and 297. That's after 160 results. The computer changes its mind, of course, as things come in. But how do you, suppose you get something on those lines, what are you going to do?
Well, I'm going to reply to your question. And the first thing I say to you is that I don't accept the result until the electorate have decided.
Yes.
The last balance of payments figures, the computer coughed at Uxbridge, and this made a great problem on our balance of payments. So I prefer the human factor to the technologists. So that is the first question. But if, as you say, the balance of power situation is in the hands of the Liberal Party, this is a question which I will discuss with my parliamentary colleagues when I meet them on Monday. They have, first of all, to decide who they're going to elect as their leader. And then we will come to a view, and it will not be announced even under your rigorous cross-examination, courteous but searching. It will be decided in due course when I have consulted the views of the party.
Now, just supposing, Mr. Thorpe, that your party were to elect you as leader, which is not beyond the bounds of possibility.
It's possible, and I haven't yet finally decided whether I'll be a candidate, but I think it is possible, yes.
Well, let's assume you'd answer the clear-cut call of public duty.
Yes.
Would you still say that you would not serve in a coalition with Mr. Wilson if Mr. Wilson were the Prime Minister and that situation arose?
I never said that during the whole course of the election. What I said was that I believe that if there had to be a coalition, it must be on the basis of moderate policies under the leadership of a moderate leader who could unite the people of this country. And I expressed the view that I didn't believe that either of the other two party leaders would be capable of that act of unity. That was a personal expression. I went no further than that. And however hard you press me, I think it would be wholly irresponsible to start saying what one would and would not do and what conditions and all the rest of it. All I can tell you is that I will consult my colleagues, and collectively we will do what we believe is in the best interests of the nation.
Thank you, Mr. Thorpe.
Let's go now to Carshalton for the result at Robert Carr's
I
seat.
give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Carr Leonard Robert, 24,440. Smallbone Hester Margaret Gatty, 11,695. Walker Peter James, 18,750. And that Leonard Robert Carr has been duly elected to serve as a Member of Parliament for the constituency.
Absolutely no swing. The ratio of the Conservative and Labour votes just the same as we think it would have been in 1970.
May I first of all say to you, Mr. Mayor, and to the Chief Officer and all his staff, a very warm thanks and congratulations, I'm sure on behalf of my fellow candidates as well as myself, for the way in which you have conducted this election. I know that those who were in polling stations from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night had a very hard day. Certainly early this morning the temperature in many polling stations was not far above freezing, and I do think all of us owe a very great debt of gratitude to those who have run this election during this polling day, and I do want to move a very warm vote of thanks to all of you who have done that. And also, of course, for the way in which the count has been conducted tonight. I'm sure all of us feel that this couldn't have been better in any way. May I, secondly, thank, of course...
Well, there's Mr. Robert Carr, the Home Secretary. He was thought to have been in some trouble in that seat, but it hasn't turned out to be so. Now, one or two interesting points while all that was going on. The Labour have taken Hornchurch. That means the return of Alan Lee Williams to Parliament. He's very much a pro-European in Labour ranks and will have an influence in the Labour Party in the House of Commons. You saw that the Conservatives have lost in Birmingham Handsworth there. Sidney Chapman has lost to John Lee, who was an MP for Reading between 66 and 70. We have an interesting recount in Bolton West. The Conservatives already lost Bolton East. Conservatives have held Lancaster, which might have been marginal, but there it is. But in Bradford West, Edward Lyons, also on the right wing of the Labour Party, or perhaps one should say in the centre of the Labour Party, has recaptured that seat, has held that seat, John Wilkinson, who was the Conservative there, having failed. And again, perhaps, again, very significant indeed on those European side, that European side of the Labour Party, Dr. David Owen has taken the seat in Plymouth Devonport against Dame Joan Vickers. And of course, one of the interesting things, I think, David, is going to be the composition of the Labour Party, which comes back to Parliament this time, in which way Mr. Wilson can indeed turn.
Yes, I think the feelings of the Labour Party were very different when they've got 100 offices to divide around among them. Though there is a great determination in the Labour Party not to repeat the mistakes of last time if they get a clear margin. Peter Walker holds Worcester. Well, that's hardly surprising. It did have a majority of only 4 in 1945, but it has been Conservative ever since 1923.
You look suitably grim there, I think. I wouldn't perhaps imagine, the way the results are going tonight, that he could expect to remain Secretary for Trade and Industry very long.
The Conservatives held Cheadle, the other half of the Hazel Grove seat, which was thought to be a chance for the Liberals to win.
Well, the moment you say, well, the Conservatives, as we said, holding Lancaster. Let's look now at what Labour has, in fact, picked up tonight, besides a lot of thoughts about how, whether and when they will form the next government. Keighley, a straight win, Luton East, and of course they've taken the other Luton, Stockport North, Battersea South, Ilford South, we still wait to hear from Ilford North, Tom Armanger's seat, Wall East, Andrew Fold's seat, Dudley West, Bolton East, and there's a recount in Bolton West, Plymouth Devonport, and Birmingham Handsworth. So, there we are, and nobody can be quite sure. Still looks like a deadlock election at this moment nobody quite certain who will really go over the door of 10 Downing Street. And the secret is in the ballot boxes still, and the count coming tomorrow, and already perhaps inside the computer, which is doing its best for us. Labour taking Sheffield Heeley. That's Mr. Hooley back for Heeley. There has been a redistribution there, and Mr. Hooley, given perhaps one of the finest slogans in the land, yes, lost the seat in 70, but he's back there now. Let's look at some results. Up in the northeast, we had some results. Well, no, I think we have some news from Mr. Heath at Sidcup. Let's go there first.
Mr. Heath, you've been looking rather cheerful in view of the way that the campaign has been going, the results have been going. What's your reaction to the results so far?
I'm not going to comment on the results as far as the national situation is concerned. I'll comment on them tomorrow when the position's absolutely clear.
You want to wait until everything is decided before you say anything?
Yes, I do, yes.
What's your reaction to the result here in this new seat at Sidcup?
Oh, I'm very pleased with this result. I think it's a very good result indeed. We had a very high poll. It was just on 85%. But then we're accustomed to having that in this part of the world, but it is still a very high poll. The total electorate is only 49,000, and so a majority of 9,613 on that sort of electorate is also a very large majority, much larger than we were anticipating. I think the other thing about it is that people have said that Europe ought to be an important issue. The candidate who fought on an anti-common market issue just got 600 votes. It's another aspect of the campaign, I think.
As Prime Minister, do you actually benefit from your personal role in politics in a campaign like this, or do you lose out because you can't be in the constituency as much as you'd like to be?
I think to a certain extent one loses out. You see, in my original constituency of Bexley, part of which came into this constituency, until I became leader of the party, then I spent a great deal of the time canvassing individual electors. We had 27,000 houses, and I used to canvass about 26,000 of them. Well, that gave me a personal contact all the time with the electors throughout the campaign. Of course, it's been impossible to do that since I became leader of the party. Obviously, there are those who helped me down here with canvassing, but it does mean that I can't maintain that continuous personal contact which I had before.
What lessons have you learnt from the campaign as a whole, in general, over the last 3 weeks?
As far as the campaign generally is concerned, I think that the issues on which we fought have been absolutely right, and we've put forward the right solutions to them.
You believe that the issues you presented were wholly accepted by the electorate?
Well, I didn't say that. What I said was I think the issues which we put before the electorate were absolutely right, and the solutions we put forward to the problems are also right.
Sorry, I wasn't talking about the result. I meant, you mean that you were talking about the issues that the electorate were going to make their minds up on?
Yes, indeed. Yes. Yeah.
Do you think that you were damaged over the period of the campaign by particular events, by the trade figures, if you like, and the various other incidents that happened during the event, or were those run-of-the-mill events that would happen anyway?
Well, they weren't run-of-the-mill events, but part of the campaign was to explain to the nation what was the cause of these events and how they ought to be handled. And it is on that in which the nation has had to make up its mind, and we shall know the results of that tomorrow.
Was the style of the campaign beneficial to the Liberals, do you think? The question of divisiveness between the two major parties helping the Liberal?
Well, I think we want to leave that, and I'll comment later on about that.
Can I ask you lastly what your plans are now, Mr. Heath?
I'm going back to London.
To the Conservative Central Office?
No, I'm going back to number 10.
And to bed, or shall we be seeing you later on this evening?
No, I don't think you'll be seeing me later on tonight.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Now there's Mr. Heath talking to David Dimbleby. While he was talking, rather bad news for him. Labour taking 2 seats, Belper, which they would have taken in 1970, George Brown's old seat, but they've gone now to Rod McFarquhar. West Bromwich East, Labour has taken. They've also recaptured Dartford. That means Sidney Irving is back there. And of course, as you would have expected, there's a recount at Oxford. There always is in this kind of election. But this is turning out now to be a very narrow election result indeed. Absolutely into injury time, I suppose one might say. And Graham Pyatt, what does the computer think about it?
Well, indeed, Alistair, it really is neck and neck. We've nearly got 200 results in, and as you can see, the computer is predicting 302 seats for Conservative, 305 for Labour, 14 for the Liberals. That's a very slender majority for Labour over Conservatives of 3. It just means 2 seats going the other way from what the computer expects.
And we should mention the others. There is a possibility, it's not only just 14 for the Liberals, but an estimate at the moment, especially in line for Northern Ireland, of 14 other seats, indeed, which does mean 28 seats holding the balance, possibly.
All right, let's go now to Birmingham Peribah for the result.
They told me to shut up.
tremendous...
I, the undersigned, being the Deputy Acting Returning Officer for the constituency above mentioned, that is Birmingham Perry-Barr, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows, namely, Hovers, Kenneth
Liberal.
John,
Liberal.
6044. Kinsey, Joseph Ronald,
Conservative.
15,937. Rooker, Geoffrey William,
Labour.
17,960. Shorthouse,
National.
Arthur Cosham,
National Front.
853. Majority of 2,023 for Rooker. And Geoffrey William Rooker has therefore been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency. The number of spoilt papers were 18.
Local opinion poll had predicted.
But again, I imagine Mr. Powell may very well claim it as his own. However, David, there have been some other very interesting results coming along. The Conservatives actually taken Acton. That's Sir George Young, economic advisor at the Post Office. So
that was redistribution. That was expected. It was one of the invert seats.
It's still, here's a very surprising result indeed, if true, that Labour has taken Marion Nairn, Gordon Campbell fighting Winnie Ewing of the Scottish Nationalists, and it would appear on the strength of that that Labour squeaked in between the two.
Well, I'm very, very surprised.
Well, they say in a three-horse race, back the outsider of the three, but we'll check that one out. If that's so, it's the first cabinet minister to go. There's a recount at Kingswood there, just to the east of Bristol. Let's have a little look at Merthyr Tydfil. This has shown some surprises in the past. It shows now 4 lost deposits of the Labour stronghold.
And a major slump in the Welsh nationalist vote. Plaid Cymru was hoping for a breakthrough there. They'd got 38% in the by-election. They're down to 22%. And this seat really does represent, I think, a gain for Labour. We reckon that that's about a 2% swing to Labour. The Liberals only got 17% of the vote there.
And here's John Lee's result. Back again, he was the member for Reading, and Sidney Chapman out.
A biggish swing. That just neighbours on Smethwick and the in Powell country.
And here's Bolton East. This is Lawrence Reed out there in Bolton East. There's big news coming for Plaid Cymru, though, I think, in a moment. But there is a Labour gain in Bolton East. All right, here is the big news. Plaid Cymru, that's their first success tonight. The Welsh Nationalists taking their in Meirionydd. And although some of their other results haven't been too successful, this must keep their peckers up for a little while now.
I think Meirionydd is they were one of the 3 seats they hoped to win most. Carnarvon, Meirionydd and Aberdare. Anglesey was another hope, and we know they haven't got Anglesey. But I think there are these 2 more seats they might get. It does affect the others' numbers, holding the balance of power in the next Parliament.
And with the Conservatives holding Bexley Heath, that was Mr. Heath's old seat there, and his agent Reg Pye stayed behind to save it for the Conservatives. They've done so. I think, however, Robin Day is talking to Robert Carr down at Carshalton.
Good morning, Mr. Carr.
Good morning, Robin.
With the news that your cabinet colleague, Mr. Gordon Campbell, the Secretary of State for Scotland, has lost his seat, how do you see this election as a whole?
Well, I've been so busily occupied here in Carshalton, I haven't yet taken in all the news.
Well, let me tell you what our computer says. It says Conservatives 303, Labour 304, Liberals 14, and the others, which we don't know anything about, another 15 or so.
Well, that looks like a cliffhanger with some time to go.
Are you still hopeful of being a cabinet minister tomorrow night?
Well, certainly I am. We've been doing very well in this part of London.
I want to bring in Mr. Ron Hayward, who's on my other line over at Transport House. Hold on,
Yes,
Mr.
indeed.
Carr. Ron Hayward, how do you see it?
Well, on my list, of course, everybody's got a list of marginals, but we've got our own list here, which has been prepared by a very experienced national agent, and we needed 14 gains from my list before I began to feel really confident. Now, we are beyond that 14 gains. And,
Confident of what, Mr. Hayward?
confident that we're going to see a Labour government.
With an overall majority?
We're confident we're going to see a Labour government at the moment, Robin, and I say this and I say it again, if there is a majority at all for a Labour government, be it a majority, with a good majority or a minority, there will be a Labour government. I'd just like to say this to Mr. Carr, to congratulate him that he's held his seat
Thank you very
And
much.
Also to say, Mr. Khan, I'm sure you will agree with me, you fought against a very good young Labour candidate.
Yes, I was glad to congratulate him in my speech on thanking the returning officer.
I predict, Mr. Khan, that we shall see him in the House of Commons, and he's going to have a very good parliamentary career.
You won't.
Well, we shall have to see, but I wouldn't be too happy about that if I was you, old man. You should have seen your Prime Minister talking 5 minutes ago.
But whichever of your parties holds gets the government, how do you view a situation in this tremendously difficult economic and industrial situation when there's a minority government? Ron Hayward? If there is one.
Harold Wilson has made this absolutely crystal clear. We're not going into coalition with any party. If we have only a majority of one, we shall govern. We should start to go through with their programme. If they defeat us, we shall come back to the people, and despite the odds against us and the partisan press this time, if we come back, we shall go back with a bigger majority. I'm every confidence in that.
Do you think that's the right course for Labour to follow in the event of there being a minority party with
Absolutely certain. I'm sure Mr. Wilson's going to say the same.
Well, I'm not going to make any comments about this at the moment. When before I came out onto the floor in my own count, I noticed the computer and various people were forecasting quite a substantial Labour majority. Now I notice it's come down to only one. And I suspect before we've finished that will have changed again. And I think the forecast at the moment is really rather rash. You see, because not only have I done well here in Carshalton, in what everybody thought was a highly marginal seat, and I got a bigger majority than I had in my old one, which was thought to be less marginal. But of course we have recaptured Sutton next door. So I think there's a lot of the story still to be told. And I think anybody who forecasts at the moment is really pretty rash.
Well, we've got a lot of rash people here. Mr. Hayward, what do you say?
Well, just one thing. I think you should remind Bob Carr, you know, this is not a political party broadcast. Polling stopped at 10 o'clock. Who's he kidding?
I'm not making any party political broadcast. I'm commenting on such results as I know. And I noticed the Labour Party forecast has dropped a lot since I last saw it.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Alistair?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the situation is, after that very civilized exchange, that again the Conservative resistance seems to be going on. They have held Bolton West after being in some trouble there. That's Robert Redmond has held on there. And Mr. Tony Royal, who left the government just at the end of last year, has held Richmond. So that's a reverse for the Liberals, because they hoped that Dr. Rundle would have taken that seat. So the Conservatives have held Richmond. And we are seeing here's a Labour gain at Liverpool Garston.
That's a very surprising one, if correct.
That, of course, is one where the Conservatives will, I think, really regard as a major upset.
7.5% swing to Labour. It means that Labour would have 8 of the 9 seats in Liverpool. The Liberal challenge in Liverpool has failed completely, though the Liberals only got 16% there.
And I think we just have news coming in now that Alan Green is out in Preston South. Labour have taken that marginal. So, again, that's a count up for Mr. Wilson, taking that seat back again. This is one of the very swing seats in the country. And, of course, it is going now to the party which is ahead, even although it is only very marginally ahead. And I think Labour have also taken Gravesend. That is one of the most marginal seats. It always goes with the winning party, I think.
And it's thought to be the most representative seat in Britain. Last time it told us just what was going to happen with a pre-poll. It may be telling us now, though I notice that the computer is now putting the Conservatives ahead of Labour, 304 to 302.
Well, let's clear up with the man who talks to the computer. Come on, talk to us, Graham.
Well, indeed, as David's just said, the prediction has now put the Conservatives ahead by 2 seats. The Liberal Party is predicting as having 14, and other parties are also predicted as having 14. We must add these 2 figures together to see that we might well be in a situation where neither of the major parties has an overall 318. We're not certain that that's happening, but that seems to be the outcome on which the computer is converging at this